The Allegory of the Cave. Plato's Allegory of the Cave is one of the most famous philosophical metaphors, illustrating how humans perceive reality and the struggle to attain true knowledge. Imagine a dark cave where prisoners have been chained since birth, unable to move their heads. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, objects are carried, casting shadows on the cave wall. The prisoners, never having seen anything else, mistake these shadows for reality. To them, a moving shadow of a book is a book. They know nothing of the real world outside the cave. One day, a prisoner is freed and dragged outside. At first, the sunlight blinds him. He struggles to accept that the objects he now sees, trees, animals, the sky, are more real than the shadows he once believed to be the full extent of existence. Over time, he realizes the truth. The world outside the cave is vast and full of genuine forms, while the cave was an illusion. If he returns to free the others, they may not believe him. They might even resist, preferring their familiar but false world. Plato uses this story to illustrate the difference between appearance and reality. Most people live in ignorance, mistaking perceptions for truth. The journey out of the cave represents enlightenment, learning to see beyond illusions. It's a painful but necessary process, revealing that wisdom requires breaking free from comforting but deceptive beliefs. The Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus is a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of identity and change over time. Theseus, a legendary Greek hero, owned a grand wooden ship. Over many years, the ship's planks began to rot, so one by one they were replaced with new planks. Eventually, every single part of the ship had been replaced. The question arises, is it still the same ship? Now imagine all the original planks were carefully stored and later used to reconstruct an identical ship. This leads to another question. Which one is the real ship of Theseus? The one that had its parts replaced gradually, or the one rebuilt with the original materials? This dilemma explores the nature of identity. If something slowly changes over time but retains continuity, is it still the same? This applies beyond ships to people, objects, even personal identity. Our bodies replace cells constantly, yet we consider ourselves the same person over decades. But if identity is tied to physical continuity, does a reconstructed version of something count as the original? The Ship of Theseus highlights the fluidity of identity. Philosophers debate whether things remain the same when altered, or if identity is tied to the sum of its parts at a single moment. In modern times, this thought experiment applies to AI, cloning, and even personal transformation. How much can we change before we're no longer the same? The trolley problem. The trolley problem is one of the most famous thought experiments in ethics, designed to challenge our moral intuitions about right and wrong. A runaway trolley is speeding down a track. If nothing is done, it will kill 5 people who are tied to the rails. You are standing next to a lever that can switch the trolley onto another track where only one person is tied down. The question is simple, yet deeply unsettling. Do you pull the lever and actively cause one person's death to save 5? Or do you do nothing and let the trolley continue on its path? On the surface, many argue that pulling the lever is the morally right choice. Sacrificing one to save 5 follows a utilitarian approach, which prioritizes the greatest good for the greatest number. But others argue that pulling the lever makes you directly responsible for the death of the one person. Whereas doing nothing means you didn't cause harm, you merely allowed it to happen. This aligns more with deontological ethics, which emphasizes the inherent morality of actions rather than their consequences. The problem becomes even more complex with variations. Suppose instead of a lever, you could stop the trolley by pushing a large person off a bridge onto the tracks, physically using them as a human barrier. Many people instinctively reject this, even though the math is the same: 1 life for 5. This suggests that our moral judgments are not purely logical, but shaped by deep-seated emotional and ethical principles. The trolley problem remains a vital ethical dilemma, especially in modern debates about self-driving cars, military decisions, and medical ethics. Determinism versus free will. The debate between determinism and free will is one of the oldest and most profound in philosophy, striking at the core of human existence. Determinism is the idea that every event, including human actions, is dictated by prior causes. If the universe operates like a vast chain of cause and effect, then everything we do is simply the result of previous conditions. Our biology, environment, upbringing, even the laws of physics. If determinism is true, then free will is an illusion. We may feel like we're making choices, but those choices were already set in motion long before we became aware of them. Free will, on the other hand, suggests that we have real agency over our decisions. The ability to choose between different options, to change our minds, to act independently, means we are not simply products of fate. Many argue that without free will, concepts like morality, responsibility, and justice lose meaning. If someone had no choice but to commit a crime, can they truly be blamed for it? A middle ground is compatibilism, the idea that determinism and free will can coexist. This perspective suggests that while our actions may be influenced by external factors, we still possess a meaningful level of choice. Even if certain factors shape our decisions, we are still the ones making them. Modern science complicates the debate. Neuroscience suggests that our brains make decisions before we are even conscious of them, hinting at determinism. Yet on a human level, we continue to experience life as if we are making choices freely. The question remains, are we truly in control, or are we just following a script written by the universe? Existential angst. Existential angst is a deep, unsettling feeling of anxiety or dread that arises from confronting the reality of human existence. It's the moment when you realize that life has no predetermined meaning, that the universe is indifferent to your struggles, and that you alone are responsible for creating purpose in your life. This concept is central to existentialist philosophy, particularly in the works of thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Martin Heidegger. Kierkegaard described it as the dizziness of freedom, the overwhelming realization that, unlike a stone or a tree, you are not bound by an inherent purpose. You must choose your own path. And with that freedom comes the terrifying responsibility of making the right choices. For Sartre, existential angst or nausea arises when we confront the absurdity of existence. Why are we here? Why does anything matter? We crave external validation, yet we are alone in our decisions. There is no cosmic blueprint guiding us, only the weight of our own choices. This realization can be paralyzing. Some try to escape it by clinging to religious dogma, societal expectations, or mindless distractions. But existentialists argue that the only true response is to embrace the freedom to create meaning through authentic living and to act with full ownership of one's existence. While existential angst can be unsettling, it is also liberating. It forces us to stop waiting for life to happen to us and instead to actively shape it. Rather than seeing life's uncertainty as a curse, we can see it as an opportunity to define ourselves, to live with intention, and to make every moment count. Nihilism. Nihilism is the philosophical belief that life has no inherent meaning, value, or purpose. At its core, it rejects the idea that there is an objective moral order, a divine plan, or an ultimate truth governing existence. If nothing has intrinsic meaning, then everything, including morality, culture, and personal aspirations, is simply a human construct. This idea was famously explored by Friedrich Nietzsche, who proclaimed, "God is dead." He didn't mean this literally, but rather that traditional sources of meaning, religion, morality, absolute truths, were losing their power in the modern world. With this collapse, humanity faced a crisis. Without these structures, where do we find meaning? For Nietzsche, nihilism was dangerous, but also an opportunity. He warned against passive nihilism, where people sink into despair and meaninglessness. Instead, he called for active nihilism, a bold rejection of imposed values in favor of creating one's own purpose, through strength and self-overcoming. Nihilism comes in many forms. Moral nihilism argues that right and wrong are subjective and arbitrary. Epistemological nihilism questions whether we can ever truly know anything. Existential nihilism, the most well-known form, claims that life itself lacks meaning. Critics of nihilism argue that it leads to despair, hedonism, or inaction. If nothing matters, why bother doing anything? But others see it as an opportunity for radical freedom. Without preordained purpose, we are free to define our own path, to live authentically, and to create our own values. Whether nihilism is a curse or a blank canvas for personal meaning depends entirely on how one chooses to respond to it. No. Solipsism is the philosophical idea that only one's own mind is certain to exist. Everything else, people, objects, even the entire universe could be an illusion, existing only within your consciousness. If you've ever wondered, what if I'm the only real person and everyone else is just a projection of my mind? You stumbled upon solipsism. At its core, solipsism questions whether we can ever truly know that anything beyond our subjective experience is real. After all, everything you perceive, colors, sounds, sensations, exists only within your mind as neural signals. You've never experienced the world directly, only your mind's interpretation of it. If this is the case, what proof is there that anything external exists at all? Philosophers like René Descartes wrestled with this dilemma. His famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, was an attempt to ground certainty in at least one undeniable truth. The self that is thinking must exist. But beyond that, how do we prove the existence of anything else? Descartes ultimately invoked God as a guarantee that reality isn't a deception. Others, like George Berkeley, argued that existence is dependent on perception. Things exist because they are perceived either by us or by a higher being. Solipsism is an unsettling yet fascinating idea. If taken to the extreme, it could lead to an isolated and detached way of thinking. After all, if nothing else is real, why care about anything? However, most people reject solipsism in practical life, assuming that the external world exists, even if we can never prove it with absolute certainty. The problem of evil. The problem of evil is one of the most challenging questions in philosophy and theology. If an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God exists, why does evil exist? This dilemma has troubled thinkers for centuries. If God is omnipotent, all-powerful, he could eliminate evil. If he is omniscient, all-knowing, he would be aware of all suffering. If he is omnibenevolent, all-good, he would want to prevent suffering. And yet, the world is full of pain, cruelty, and injustice. How can this be reconciled? There are several classic responses to this problem. One is the free will defense, which argues that God allows evil because true free will requires the possibility of choosing wrong. And if humans were incapable of evil, they wouldn't truly be free. Another argument is the soul-making theodicy, which suggests that suffering and hardship exist to help humans grow morally and spiritually. Without struggle, there would be no development of courage, compassion, or resilience. Some take a different approach and claim that human understanding is too limited to grasp divine justice. What appears as senseless suffering to us might serve a higher purpose beyond our comprehension. Others argue that evil is necessary as a contrast to good. Without darkness, would we appreciate light? Atheists and skeptics, however, argue that the sheer amount of suffering in the world, natural disasters, diseases, senseless violence, makes it unlikely that a benevolent God is in control. Some conclude that if a deity exists, it might not be omnipotent, omniscient, or perfectly good. The problem of evil remains a central challenge in the philosophy of religion, raising fundamental questions about morality, human suffering, and the nature of the divine. Whether one sees it as an argument against God or as a test of faith depends on one's perspective. The paradox of the heap, also known as the so-rights paradox, is a logical puzzle that challenges how we define vague concepts, particularly when gradual change leads to an unclear distinction between one state and another. Imagine you have a heap of sand. If you remove one grain, it's still a heap. Remove another and another. Surely it's still a heap. But what happens when you continue this process? At what exact point does it stop being a heap and become just a small pile, or even just scattered grains? Conversely, if you start with a single grain of sand and add one at a time, when does it officially become a heap? This paradox applies to more than just sand. Consider baldness. If a man loses one hair, he's not bald. But if he keeps losing them, at some unclear point, we begin to call him bald. Likewise, when does a fetus become a child? When does an old car become junk? When does a child become an adult? The paradox of the heap highlights a fundamental issue in human language and reasoning. Many concepts we rely on daily heap, rich, tall, bald, are not sharply defined. The vagueness of these definitions leads to paradoxical situations. Some philosophers, like those in the school of fuzzy logic, argue that truth is not always binary true or false, but exists on a spectrum. Others propose that our language simply lacks the precision needed to resolve such paradoxes. At its core, this paradox forces us to question how we categorize the world. If we cannot pinpoint where a transition occurs, does that mean our definitions are flawed? Or does reality itself resist clear boundaries? Dualism versus monism. The debate between dualism and monism is one of the oldest and most fundamental in philosophy. It concerns the nature of reality and the relationship between the mind and the physical world. Dualism is the belief that reality consists of two fundamentally different substances: the physical body-brain, matter, and the non-physical mind consciousness, soul. René Descartes was one of the most famous dualists, arguing that the mind and body are separate but interact. He saw the mind as something immaterial, a thinking entity, while the body was simply a machine, obeying physical laws. The problem, of course, is this: how can a non-physical mind influence a physical body? If thoughts and decisions arise in an immaterial soul, how do they trigger neurons and bodily movement? Monism, on the other hand, holds that everything is made of just one fundamental substance. There are two main types: materialism or physicalism. Everything, including thoughts and consciousness, arises from physical processes in the brain. According to this view, what we call mind is just brain activity, neurons firing, chemical reactions, and electrical signals. Idealism. Reality is entirely mental. Some philosophers, like George Berkeley, argued that the physical world only exists as perceptions in our minds. There is no external material reality, only consciousness and experience. Both positions have deep implications. If dualism is true, then consciousness might exist beyond the body, opening the door to ideas like the afterlife or souls. But if monism is correct, then everything we experience, from emotions to thoughts, is reducible to physics and biology. This debate is still unresolved. Neuroscience increasingly supports a materialist view, showing how mental states correlate with brain activity. Yet the hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience arises from physical processes, remains a major challenge. Whether we are more than just physical beings is a question that continues to shape philosophy, science, and even personal beliefs. Moral relativism. Moral relativism is the philosophical view that morality is not absolute, but is instead shaped by cultural, historical, or personal perspectives. In other words, what is considered right or wrong depends on context. There is no single universal moral truth that applies to all people at all times. This idea challenges moral absolutism, which holds that certain ethical principles are unchanging and apply universally. For example, a moral absolutist might argue that murder is always wrong, regardless of culture or situation. A moral relativist, however, would argue that moral judgments depend on the circumstances. What one society considers immoral, another may see as acceptable or even virtuous. Cultural relativism suggests that morality is determined by societal norms. Practices like polygamy, the death penalty, or arranged marriage may be seen as acceptable in some cultures, but unacceptable in others. Subjective relativism takes it even further, arguing that morality is up to each individual. What is right for one person may not be right for another. Historical relativism considers how moral values shift over time. For example, slavery was once widely accepted but is now universally condemned. Critics argue that moral relativism can lead to ethical nihilism, the belief that morality is meaningless. If no moral standard is better than another, does that mean we cannot condemn genocide or oppression? Some philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, argue that certain ethical principles must be universal to ensure justice and human dignity. Despite these criticisms, moral relativism remains an important perspective in discussions about tolerance, ethics, and the diversity of human beliefs. It forces us to question, are our moral convictions truly objective, or simply a product of our upbringing? Into tabula rasa, Latin for blank slate, is the philosophical concept that individuals are born without inherent knowledge or mental content, and that all knowledge comes from experience and perception. This idea is most famously associated with John Locke, who argued that the human mind starts as a blank sheet and is shaped entirely by external influences, such as education, culture, and environment. The idea of tabula rasa has profound implications. It suggests that human behavior is not predetermined by genetics, but is shaped by upbringing and experience. This perspective influenced modern psychology, particularly behaviorism, which argues that people can be conditioned to behave in certain ways based on external stimuli. It also underlies many ideas about education, emphasizing the role of learning and environment in shaping intelligence and character. However, modern science complicates this view. Research in genetics and neuroscience suggests that some aspects of personality, intelligence, and even morality may be innate. Infants show preferences, emotional responses, and basic problem-solving abilities long before they've had enough experience to learn them. This has led many to believe that human nature is a mix of nature and nurture. Some traits are inborn, while others are shaped by experience. Even so, tabula rasa remains a powerful metaphor for human potential. If we are shaped by experience, then education, culture, and personal choices have the power to transform us completely. Whether we start as a blank slate or not, our ability to learn and grow remains central to the human experience. The absurd. The absurd is the idea that human beings constantly search for meaning in a universe that is silent, indifferent, and ultimately devoid of inherent purpose. This concept, most famously explored by Albert Camus, describes the tension between our deep desire for understanding and the chaotic, unpredictable nature of existence. At the heart of the absurd is a contradiction. Humans crave order, reason, and meaning, but the universe offers none. We look for purpose in religion, philosophy, and personal ambitions, yet no universal answer presents itself. This realization can be deeply unsettling, leading some to despair or nihilism. Camus, however, rejected nihilism. He argued that instead of seeking external meaning, we should embrace the absurd and live with full awareness of it. He used the myth of Sisyphus, a man condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, as a metaphor for human existence. Even though Sisyphus's task is pointless, Camus imagines him happy because he accepts his fate and finds joy in the struggle itself. The absurd is not about hopelessness, but about liberation. It means we are free to create our own meaning, instead of relying on imposed systems of belief. There is no cosmic script, no grand design controlling our fate. This can feel terrifying, but it also offers radical freedom. Instead of seeking answers that do not exist, we can live fully embracing life's fleeting moments and shaping our own purpose in the face of meaninglessness. The eternal recurrence. The eternal recurrence is a thought experiment proposed by Friedrich Nietzsche, challenging us to consider how we live our lives and what it means to fully embrace existence. The idea suggests that you will have to relive your entire life exactly as it happened, over and over again, for eternity. Every joy, every sorrow, every mistake, and every triumph. Nothing would change, and there would be no escape. This idea forces a powerful question. If you had to relive your life infinitely, would you be able to say yes to it? Would you curse the idea of feeling trapped by regret and dissatisfaction? Or would you embrace it, living in such a way that you would gladly repeat your choices forever? Nietzsche saw this as the ultimate test of how much a person affirms their existence. If the thought of eternal recurrence horrifies you, it might mean you are not living in a way that is truly fulfilling or authentic. Rather than suggesting that the universe literally repeats itself, Nietzsche used eternal recurrence as a psychological and ethical challenge. It forces us to ask ourselves, am I living a life I would be willing to experience endlessly? Instead of waiting for some future reward or fearing past mistakes, it demands that we embrace each moment fully. For Nietzsche, the ideal response to this challenge is amor fati, the love of fate, to affirm life completely. To say yes to all experiences, even suffering, is the highest form of strength. Eternal recurrence is not about fear, but about responsibility. If life has no external meaning beyond what we give it, then we must live in such a way that we would joyfully repeat our existence forever. Social contract theory. Social contract theory is the idea that societies are formed through an implicit or explicit agreement between individuals and their governing institutions. It suggests that people give up some personal freedoms in exchange for security, order, and the benefits of living in a structured community. Without this agreement, life would be chaotic, governed only by brute force. This idea is central to political philosophy and has been explored by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Hobbes believed that in a state of nature, a world without laws or government, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this anarchy, people agree to obey a ruler or governing body, even if it means surrendering some of their freedoms. Locke, on the other hand, argued that the social contract exists to protect natural rights, such as life, liberty, and property. If a government fails to protect these rights, the people have a right to rebel. Rousseau took a different approach, believing that true legitimacy comes only when people collectively participate in shaping the laws they live under. At its core, social contract theory is about the balance between individual freedom and societal order. It asks, how much control should a government have? What do we owe each other as members of a society? And when, if ever, is it justified to break the contract? This theory remains highly relevant in modern debates about justice, democracy, and human rights, as it underpins our understanding of law, governance, and citizenship. The veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance is a thought experiment proposed by philosopher John Rawls to determine what a truly fair society would look like. It challenges us to design a just system without knowing where we personally would end up within it. Imagine that before you are born, you are behind a veil of ignorance that hides your future identity. You don't know whether you will be rich or poor, male or female, healthy or disabled, part of the majority or a marginalized group. Since you have no idea where you'll land in society, you must create rules that are fair for everyone. Would you design a world where the rich have all the power and the poor suffer? If there's a chance you might be born into poverty? Would you allow discrimination if you might end up in the group being discriminated against? Rawls argued that under these conditions, rational people would choose principles of justice that ensure fairness for all. They would prioritize basic freedoms, equal opportunities, and protections for the most vulnerable, since they might end up among them. This leads to what he calls justice as fairness, a system that does not favor any particular group, but instead seeks to create an equitable society. The veil of ignorance remains a powerful tool for thinking about ethics and policy. Well, it forces us to step outside our personal biases and consider what is fair from a truly neutral perspective. It's widely used in discussions about economic inequality, healthcare, human rights, and social justice, offering a simple yet profound way to evaluate the fairness of any system. The Azad problem, the Azad problem, also known as Hume's guillotine, is a philosophical challenge introduced by David Hume. It questions whether moral or prescriptive statements can be logically derived from factual or descriptive statements is. Hume observed that many arguments about morality attempt to say what should be done based on how things are. For example, someone might argue that because humans have historically lived in hierarchical societies, we ought to continue doing so. But Hume pointed out a fundamental gap. Just because something is a certain way does not mean it should be that way. This problem has profound implications for ethics. If we cannot logically derive moral principles from facts alone, then where do our moral obligations come from? Are they purely subjective, or do they have an independent foundation? Some philosophers argue that reason alone cannot establish moral truths. Others attempt to bridge the gap through social contracts, human well-being, or religious doctrine. The Azad problem forces us to examine our ethical reasoning carefully. It reminds us, just because something is natural or traditional doesn't automatically make it right. Many moral arguments require additional justification beyond simple observations about the world. This distinction remains a cornerstone of modern debates in ethics, law, and political philosophy, urging us to think critically about whether our moral conclusions are logically justified. Hedonism. Hedonism is the philosophical belief that pleasure is the highest good and the ultimate goal of human life. It argues that what is morally right or worthwhile is determined by what brings the most pleasure and the least pain. At its core, hedonism is based on a simple idea. Happiness is the primary measure of a good life. Ancient Greek philosophers, like Epicurus, championed a refined form of hedonism, emphasizing not just fleeting physical pleasures, but long-term well-being and tranquility. Epicurean hedonism suggests that true pleasure comes from a balanced life, free from unnecessary desires, fears, and pain. This contrasts with crude or extreme hedonism, which seeks immediate gratification regardless of consequences. Critics argue that a purely hedonistic lifestyle can be shallow or self-destructive. If pleasure is the only goal, does that mean we should avoid challenges, responsibilities, or sacrifices? Philosophers like Immanuel Kant rejected hedonism entirely, arguing that morality should be based on duty and principles, not just pleasure. Others, like John Stuart Mill, refined hedonism into utilitarianism, suggesting that the best actions are those that maximize happiness for the greatest number of people, not just the individual. Hedonism remains a powerful and controversial idea. It raises fundamental questions. What makes life meaningful? And is pleasure alone a sufficient measure of fulfillment? While hedonism encourages us to seek joy and avoid suffering, it also forces us to consider whether a life devoted solely to pleasure is truly a life well lived. Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is a famous argument by the mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal that attempts to justify belief in God not through evidence, but through a pragmatic cost-benefit analysis. Instead of asking whether God exists, Pascal asks, what do you stand to gain or lose by believing or not believing? He presents four possible outcomes. 1. If God exists and you believe, you gain infinite reward, heaven. 2. If God exists and you don't believe, you suffer infinite loss, hell. 3. If God doesn't exist and you believe, you lose nothing significant, heaven. 4. If God doesn't exist and you don't believe, you gain nothing significant. Since belief in God could result in infinite reward, while disbelief risks infinite punishment. Pascal argues that the rational choice is to believe, even if the probability of God's existence is uncertain. The potential gain outweighs any possible loss. Critics challenge this argument in several ways. One major objection is the many gods problem. Pascal assumes a specific kind of God. But what if another deity rewards disbelief instead? Others argue that belief should be based on truth, not self-interest, and that pretending to believe for a reward is not genuine faith. Some also question whether belief is even a choice. Can one force oneself to believe simply because it seems beneficial? Despite these criticisms, Pascal's wager remains an influential argument in the philosophy of religion. It shifts the discussion from proving God's existence to considering the consequences of belief and doubt, making it a pragmatic rather than purely theological question. The cogito, I think, therefore I am. Cogito, ergo sum Latin for I think, therefore I am, is one of the most famous statements in the history of philosophy. It was introduced by René Descartes, a 17th century philosopher, as a foundational element in his quest for absolute certainty. Descartes began by doubting everything. He questioned the reliability of the senses, the existence of the physical world, even the reality of his own body. After stripping away every possible source of uncertainty, he arrived at one undeniable truth. The very act of doubting of thinking proves that there must be a self doing the thinking, no matter how deceived he might be. No matter how uncertain the world appears, if he is thinking, then he exists, at least as a thinking being. This realization became the cornerstone of modern Western philosophy. The cogito establishes a secure foundation upon which knowledge can be built, starting from the mind rather than the external world. It also marks a dramatic shift in focus from objective reality to subjective experience. Descartes believed that while the senses might deceive, rational thought, the inner voice of reason, offers a path to true knowledge. But the cogito is more than just a philosophical principle. It's a profound reminder of human consciousness, self-awareness, and the power of doubt. Even when everything else is uncertain, the fact that you are thinking is proof that you exist. The cogito. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am is one of the most foundational statements in philosophy. It serves as Descartes' ultimate proof of existence and the starting point for his method of doubt. Descartes set out to find absolute certainty by questioning everything he could possibly doubt. He realized that he could be deceived by his senses, misled by dreams, or even manipulated by an evil demon in feeding him false perceptions. If everything he perceived could be an illusion, how could he know anything for sure? One thing, however, was undeniable. The very act of doubting meant there was something doing the doubting. Even if all external reality was an illusion, the experience of thinking was real. He concluded that even in the most extreme skepticism, one fact remained beyond doubt: his own existence as a thinking being. The cogito is significant because it establishes a foundation for knowledge. It asserts that self-awareness is the first undeniable truth. However, critics argue that it assumes too much. Some question whether the I in I think is justified. Perhaps thoughts exist, but does that necessarily mean there is a thinker? Others challenge whether Descartes truly proves existence beyond just the mental realm. Despite these debates, cogito ergo sum remains a powerful starting point for epistemology. It is a reminder that no matter how uncertain the world may seem, consciousness itself is the one thing we cannot doubt. The Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma is a philosophical problem raised by Socrates in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, which challenges the foundation of morality in relation to divine authority. The dilemma asks, is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it is good? If something is good simply because the gods command it, then morality becomes arbitrary. The gods could declare murder or cruelty to be morally good, and we would have no standard by which to challenge them. This suggests that morality is not based on any inherent truth, but merely on divine preference. which could, in theory, change at any time. On the other hand, if the gods command something because it is already good, then morality exists independently of divine authority. This means that even the gods must follow moral truths that exist beyond them. However, this raises another problem. If morality is independent of divine will, then we do not need gods to understand what is right and wrong. Morality would exist as a separate, objective system that humans can discover through reason. This dilemma remains a critical issue in the philosophy of religion and ethics. It challenges the idea that morality comes solely from divine command, and instead suggests that moral reasoning must go beyond simply obeying authority. Some religious philosophers attempt to resolve the dilemma by arguing that God's nature itself is inherently good, meaning that his commands are neither arbitrary nor external. However, for many, the Euthyphro dilemma remains an open question, one that forces deeper reflection on the origins of morality. The golden mean. The golden mean is Aristotle's concept of virtue as the balance between extremes. Rather than seeing morality as rigid rules, Aristotle believed that ethical behavior lies in finding the right balance between excess and deficiency. For example, courage is a virtue, but too little courage, cowardice, is a flaw. Just as too much courage, recklessness, is also harmful. Similarly, generosity is good, but being overly stingy is selfish, while being overly extravagant is wasteful. The key to ethical living, according to Aristotle, is developing practical wisdom phronesis, to recognize where the balance lies in any given situation. The golden mean is not about mediocrity or always choosing the middle ground. It's about achieving harmony and self-mastery. It recognizes that virtues are context-dependent and that people must cultivate good habits to make balanced decisions. A person who is naturally shy may need to push themselves toward boldness, while someone naturally aggressive may need to cultivate patience. This idea has profound implications beyond personal ethics. It applies to leadership, relationships, and even politics. Extremes often lead to instability, while a well-balanced approach fosters long-term success. The golden mean encourages individuals to develop character and self-awareness, rather than blindly following rigid rules. Aristotle's ethical framework remains influential today, shaping modern discussions about virtue ethics. While other ethical systems focus on rules or consequences, the golden mean emphasizes moral growth and the cultivation of a well-rounded, virtuous life. Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a philosophical principle that states, "The simplest explanation is usually the best one." It's a tool for logical reasoning that suggests, when faced with multiple competing explanations, we should prefer the one that makes the fewest assumptions. This principle is named after the 14th century philosopher William of Ockham, who argued that unnecessary complexity should be avoided in reasoning. The idea is not that the simplest explanation is always correct, but that adding extra assumptions without evidence increases the chance of error. For example, if you hear hoofbeats outside, it is more reasonable to assume they come from a horse rather than a zebra, unless you have specific reasons to believe otherwise. Occam's razor is widely applied in science, philosophy, and everyday decision-making. In science, it helps formulate theories with the fewest assumptions, ensuring they are testable and not needlessly complicated. For instance, if two scientific models explain a phenomenon equally well, the one with fewer speculative elements is generally preferred. In medicine, it guides diagnosis. Doctors typically look for common illnesses before considering rare or exotic conditions. However, critics caution that simplicity alone does not guarantee truth. Sometimes reality is complex, and the simplest explanation may overlook crucial details. Occam's razor is best used as a heuristic, a guiding principle, rather than an absolute rule. It reminds us to be skeptical of unnecessary complications and to prioritize clarity and evidence over speculation. The principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason states that everything that exists must have a reason or explanation for why it is the way it is and not otherwise. This principle, closely associated with the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, asserts that nothing happens without a cause, reason, or sufficient explanation, even if we do not yet know what that reason is. This idea is foundational in both metaphysics and science. In physics, for example, we assume that events have causes, even if those causes are hidden or difficult to uncover. The principle also plays a role in logic and mathematics, where each statement or conclusion must be justified. Philosophically, the principle of sufficient reason leads to profound questions about existence itself. Why does the universe exist rather than nothing? Why are the laws of nature the way they are? Leibniz used this principle to argue for the existence of God, claiming that the universe must have a necessary reason for its existence, something beyond the physical world itself. Others have applied it to debates about determinism, arguing that if everything has a reason, then free will may be an illusion, since every action would ultimately be determined by prior causes. Despite its intuitive appeal, the principle has been challenged. Some argue that not everything needs a reason. Perhaps some events like quantum fluctuations happen randomly, without a clear cause. Others suggest that seeking explanations for everything might lead to an infinite regress, where every reason demands another reason, and another, and another. Whether fully accepted or not, the principle of sufficient reason remains a powerful idea that underpins how we seek to understand the world. It drives scientific inquiry, philosophical debate, and our natural human instinct to ask why. The Gettier problem. The Gettier problem is a philosophical challenge to the traditional definition of knowledge, showing that a person can have a justified true belief without actually having knowledge. This problem, introduced by Edmund Gettier in 1963, shook the foundations of epistemology and forced philosophers to rethink what it means to know something. For centuries, knowledge was commonly defined as justified true belief, or JTB. According to this definition, if you believe something, have good reasons to support it, and it happens to be true, then you know it. However, Gettier demonstrated that this definition is incomplete. By presenting cases where someone has a belief that is justified and true, but still does not seem like knowledge. Consider an example. Suppose you have a friend, Sarah, who owns a red car. One day you see her driving a red car, so you conclude, Sarah owns a red car. But unknown to you, Sarah actually sold her car the day before. And the car you saw her driving was a rental. Coincidentally, though, Sarah did buy another red car earlier that morning. Your belief is true, and you had justification for it. But was it really knowledge? It seems more like a lucky guess that happened to be correct. Gettier-style problems reveal that mere justification and truth are not enough for knowledge. There must be something more, perhaps an absence of luck, stronger evidence, or a different method of justification. The Gettier problem remains an open question in philosophy, prompting new theories about what separates real knowledge from mere coincidence. The categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is Immanuel Kant's central principle of morality, stating that ethical actions must be universal and based on duty, rather than consequences. Unlike utilitarianism, which judges actions by their outcomes, Kantian ethics argues that morality is about following absolute rules that apply to everyone, regardless of the circumstances. Kant formulated the categorical imperative in different ways, but the most famous version is this: act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In simpler terms, before taking any action, ask yourself, what if everyone did this? If the action would lead to a contradictory or undesirable world, then it is morally wrong. For example, suppose you are tempted to lie to get out of trouble. Applying the categorical imperative, you must ask, what if everyone lied when it was convenient? If lying became universal, trust would collapse, and communication would become meaningless. Since this would create a self-defeating world, lying is immoral. Another key formulation of the categorical imperative is, treat humanity, whether in yourself or in others, always as an end, never merely as a means. This means that people should never be used as tools for selfish purposes, exploiting others, manipulating people, or treating them as disposable, violates their dignity as rational beings. Kant's ethics emphasize duty, respect, and moral consistency, while some criticize it for being too rigid. Since it does not allow exceptions based on context, it remains one of the most influential moral theories. The categorical imperative challenges us to act with integrity and to ensure that our moral principles could hold for all people at all times. The mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is one of the oldest and most fundamental questions in philosophy. What is the relationship between the mind and the body? Are they separate substances? Or is the mind just a function of the brain? How do thoughts, emotions, and consciousness arise from physical matter? Quote, this problem was most famously explored by René Descartes, who argued for dualism, the idea that the mind and body are two distinct substances. According to Descartes, the body is physical, governed by the laws of nature, while the mind or soul is immaterial, capable of thought and self-awareness. The challenge for dualism is explaining how these two substances interact. If the mind is non-physical, how does it influence the body? How does a thought like, I want to raise my hand, result in physical movement? In contrast, monism argues that mind and body are not separate, materialism or physicalism. The dominant scientific view today claims that everything, including thoughts and emotions, can be explained by brain activity. According to this view, consciousness arises from neurons firing in complex patterns, and the mind is simply what the brain does. However, this leads to the hard problem of consciousness. Why do certain brain processes give rise to subjective experience? A computer processes information, but it does not feel anything. Why does the human brain create the sensation of being alive? Other theories attempt to bridge the gap. Panpsychism suggests that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, present even in the smallest particles. Functionalism compares the mind to a software program running on the brain's hardware, meaning that consciousness could, in theory, exist in artificial intelligence. The mind-body problem remains unsolved. Whether consciousness is a byproduct of brain activity, a fundamental aspect of reality, or something beyond our understanding, it continues to challenge our understanding of what it means to be human. Weakness of will, akrasia. Akrasia is the ancient Greek term for acting against one's better judgment, knowing what is right but failing to do it. It's the internal struggle between reason and impulse, where people make choices they themselves recognize as bad. Plato and Aristotle both explored akrasia, questioning why rational beings sometimes fail to follow reason. Suppose you decide to eat healthy, yet late at night you binge on junk food. You knew it was a bad choice, but you did it anyway. Why? This problem goes far beyond diet. It applies to procrastination, addiction, destructive relationships, and any situation where people act contrary to their best interests. Socrates believed that true knowledge prevents akrasia. If someone truly understands that something is bad, they would not do it. He argued that ignorance, not weakness of will, is the cause of bad decisions. Aristotle disagreed. He believed people can know what is best but still be swayed by emotions and desires. He saw akrasia as a failure of self-control, not knowledge. Modern psychology supports Aristotle's view. Studies in cognitive bias, habit formation, and self-discipline show that willpower is limited and easily undermined by stress, temptation, or fatigue. The brain often prioritizes short-term pleasure over long-term well-being. Or understanding akrasia is key to improving self-discipline. Strategies like habit building, delayed gratification, and mindfulness can help overcome it. Whether in philosophy or daily life, akrasia remains a central challenge. Knowing what is right is one thing. Consistently doing it is another. Dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is the philosophical framework developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to explain how history, society, and economic structures evolve through conflict and material conditions. It's rooted in two key ideas. Dialectics, the process of change through contradictions. Materialism, the belief that material conditions such as the economy, labor, and production shape human society rather than ideas or spiritual forces. At its core, dialectical materialism argues that history progresses through class struggle. Marx saw society as driven by contradictions between opposing economic classes, for example, between feudal lords and peasants, or between capitalists and workers. These conflicts create tensions that ultimately lead to revolutionary change. In capitalism, the contradiction lies in how wealth is produced by workers, but controlled by the owners. Marx predicted that this would lead to inevitable struggle and the eventual rise of a classless communist society. Unlike traditional idealist philosophies, which see history as shaped by ideas, dialectical materialism insists that material forces, who controls the means of production, how goods are distributed, and how labor is organized, determines societal development. In other words, economics drives history. The dominant ideology of any era, whether religion, law, or morality, is not an independent force, but a reflection of the ruling class's interests. Dialectical materialism remains influential in political theory, economics, and sociology. While some argue that Marx underestimated human agency and cultural factors, his framework continues to shape debates on inequality, labor rights, and historical progress. Whether one agrees or disagrees with Marx's thought, dialectical materialism provides a powerful lens to analyze power, change, and the economic structures that shape human history. The experience machine. The experience machine is a thought experiment proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick to challenge hedonism, the idea that pleasure is the highest good. It asks a simple but unsettling question. If you could plug into a machine that creates perfect, pleasurable experiences, would you do it? Imagine a machine that could simulate any life you desire: fame, love, adventure, pure happiness, all indistinguishable from real life. While plugged in, you wouldn't know it's fake. No suffering, no disappointments, just endless joy. Given that hedonism suggests pleasure is the ultimate goal, wouldn't the rational choice be to stay plugged in forever? Nozick argues most people would reject the machine, and that proves we value more than just pleasure. We want reality, even if it's imperfect. We care about being connected to truth, having genuine achievements, and living authentic lives, not just experiencing the illusion of happiness. This suggests that meaning, autonomy, and personal growth are more important than mere pleasure. The experience machine raises deep questions about human nature. It forces us to ask, what makes life worth living? If we could live in a simulated paradise, would it be any less meaningful? This thought experiment is highly relevant today, especially with advancements in virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and simulated worlds. Nozick's conclusion challenges us to think beyond pleasure and consider what truly makes a fulfilling life. Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that states, the best action is the one that maximizes overall happiness and minimizes suffering. It is a form of consequentialism, meaning that actions are judged based on their outcomes, rather than their intentions or inherent morality. The core idea is summed up in the principle of the greatest good for the greatest number. This philosophy was developed by Jeremy Bentham and later refined by John Stuart Mill. Bentham introduced the concept of the hedonic calculus, a method of measuring pleasure and pain to determine the morality of an action. He argued that all pleasures and pains could be weighed objectively, and that the action producing the most pleasure should be chosen. Mill, however, recognized that not all pleasures are equal. Some, such as intellectual or moral pleasures, are higher and more valuable than basic physical pleasures. Utilitarianism is often praised for its practicality. It provides a clear way to evaluate difficult moral dilemmas, for example in medical ethics, distributing limited resources to save the most lives, or in policymaking, creating laws that benefit the majority. However, it also faces serious criticisms. One major problem is the tyranny of the majority. If maximizing happiness means harming a small group, does that justify the harm? For instance, if punishing an innocent person brings peace to a society, would that be moral? Another criticism is that utilitarianism often ignores individual rights. Under strict utilitarian logic, sacrificing one person to save five would be justified. But many people find this intuitively wrong. Despite these challenges, utilitarianism remains one of the most influential moral theories in philosophy, economics, and politics. It forces us to think about how our actions affect others and whether our moral choices truly maximize well-being. Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno's paradoxes are a set of philosophical puzzles that challenge our understanding of motion, space, and infinity. Proposed by the Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea, these paradoxes argue that motion and change as we perceive them might be illusions. One of the most famous is Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine a race where Achilles, the fastest runner, gives a slow-moving tortoise a head start. By the time Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise has moved a little farther. When Achilles reaches that new point, the tortoise moves again. This continues infinitely. So paradoxically, Achilles can never catch the tortoise. Yet in reality, we know he will. So, where is the flaw in our reasoning? Another paradox is the dichotomy paradox, which states that before reaching a destination, you must first reach halfway, before halfway a quarter, before that an eighth. Since this sequence continues infinitely, it seems that motion should be impossible. Yet, we move all the time. Zeno used these paradoxes to support Parmenides' idea that change and motion are illusions. However, modern mathematics and physics explain these puzzles using the concept of limits in calculus. While there are infinitely many steps, they can sum to a finite distance, resolving the contradiction. Even though math has provided solutions, Zeno's paradoxes continue to spark debates about the nature of time, space, and infinity. They challenge our intuition and force us to question whether reality is as straightforward as it seems. The anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is a philosophical and scientific concept that addresses why the universe appears to be fine-tuned for the existence of life, particularly human life. It starts with a basic observation. The physical laws and constants of the universe, gravity, electromagnetism, nuclear forces are set in such precise ways that even the slightest variation would have made life impossible. So, why do these conditions exist? Why is the universe just right for us to be here? The weak anthropic principle suggests a simple explanation. We can observe the universe this way because we exist. In other words, if the universe weren't light-permitting, there would be no observers to question it. This doesn't explain why the universe is fine-tuned. It just states that any observation of the universe must come from a perspective where conditions allowed observers to emerge. The strong anthropic principle, on the other hand, takes it a step further, arguing that the universe must have properties that allow life to develop at some point. Some interpretations even suggest a kind of purpose or necessity behind the universe's structure. The anthropic principle raises profound questions. Is our universe uniquely suited for life? Or are there many universes, a multiverse each, with different physical laws, and we just happen to be in one that works? Critics argue that the anthropic principle can be circular or unfalsifiable. It explains the conditions of the universe by pointing to the fact that we're here to observe them. Supporters, however, see it as a useful tool in cosmology, especially when dealing with questions about fine-tuning, the origin of life, and the probability of existence itself. Whether interpreted modestly or boldly, the anthropic principle invites us to reflect on one of the deepest mysteries. Why is the universe able to know itself through us? The anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is the idea that the universe appears fine-tuned for human life, because if it weren't, we wouldn't be here to observe it. In other words, the very fact that we exist places restrictions on the kinds of universes that can exist. This principle comes in two main forms. The weak anthropic principle, WAP, states that our observations of the universe are biased because we can only exist in a universe that allows life. If the fundamental physical constants such as gravity, the speed of light, or nuclear forces were even slightly different, life as we know it would not be possible. The universe looks finely tuned, but that's only because we're observing it from the only possible perspective, one where life exists. The strong anthropic principle, SAP, goes further, suggesting that the universe must be structured in such a way that conscious life inevitably arises. Some interpretations even propose that intelligence is a fundamental feature of the cosmos, or that multiple universes exist, each with different physical laws, and we just happen to be in one that supports life. Critics argue that the anthropic principle is more of a philosophical observation than a scientific explanation. Well, it doesn't tell us why the universe has these specific conditions, only that we couldn't observe any other kind. Some see it as a weak excuse to avoid deeper questions about the origins of the universe. Others view it as a key insight into cosmology, quantum mechanics, and the potential existence of a multiverse. Regardless, it raises profound questions. Is the universe uniquely structured for life? Or are we just one lucky accident among countless other possibilities? The liar paradox. The liar paradox is a self-referential statement that leads to a logical contradiction, most famously expressed as, "This statement is false." If the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims. But if it's false, then it must be true, because it correctly states that it is false. The result is a loop with no clear resolution, revealing a deep problem in logic and language. Variations of the liar paradox have puzzled philosophers for centuries. Consider a person saying, "Everything I say is false." If that statement is true, then everything they say, including that statement, is false, creating a contradiction. Or imagine a sign that reads, "Ignore this sign." Should you follow its instructions or ignore them? This paradox challenges the foundations of logic, mathematics, and language. It was a significant issue for Bertrand Russell, who encountered similar contradictions while developing set theory. It also influenced Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that in any formal system of logic, there will always be statements that are true but unprovable. Possible solutions include rejecting self-referential statements as meaningless, creating new logical categories to handle paradoxes, or acknowledging that truth may not always be binary true or false, but may exist on a spectrum. The liar paradox remains an essential problem in philosophy, forcing us to rethink the limits of language, logic, and meaning itself. The problem of induction. The problem of induction is a fundamental challenge in epistemology, first clearly articulated by David Hume. It questions whether we can justify our reliance on past experiences to predict the future. In simple terms, just because something has happened repeatedly in the past, does that mean it will continue to happen in the future? Hume pointed out that much of human reasoning is based on inductive inference, drawing general conclusions from specific observations. For example, we assume the sun will rise tomorrow because it has risen every day before. But how do we know this? We don't have absolute proof, only past experience. Hume argued that this reasoning is circular. We assume the future will resemble the past because it always has. But that assumption itself is based on past experience, which is the very thing we're trying to justify. This problem undermines the certainty of all empirical knowledge. Science, for example, relies heavily on induction, forming general laws based on repeated experiments. But if induction itself has no logical foundation, does that mean all scientific conclusions are uncertain? Philosophers have proposed solutions. Pragmatism, arguing that induction works well in practice, so we should use it anyway. Probabilistic reasoning, suggesting that while induction isn't logically certain, it's highly likely to be reliable. However, the problem of induction remains unresolved, reminding us that much of what we know about the world is based not on certainty, but on habit and expectation. Falsificationism. Falsificationism is a scientific philosophy proposed by Karl Popper as a response to the problem of induction. Instead of trying to prove theories true through repeated observations, Popper argued that scientific progress depends on our ability to prove theories false. According to falsificationism, a scientific theory is only meaningful if it can be tested and potentially proven wrong. For example, if a theory states all swans are white, then observing thousands of white swans does not prove the theory. But finding a single black swan does prove it false. This is why Popper rejected verificationism, the idea that science should focus on confirming theories, in favor of falsifiability as the true standard of science. Falsificationism separates science from pseudoscience. A good scientific theory makes bold predictions that could, in principle, be tested and refuted. By contrast, pseudosciences like astrology or Freudian psychology often explain away counterexamples, rather than accepting that their theories could be wrong. If a theory can accommodate any possible observation, it's not scientific because it's not falsifiable. However, falsificationism has its own challenges. In real science, theories are rarely discarded after one failed experiment. Scientists often revise or refine them. Additionally, some fields like quantum mechanics or cosmology deal with entities that cannot always be directly tested. Despite these issues, falsification remains one of the most important principles in the philosophy of science, shaping how we distinguish real scientific inquiry from speculation and unfounded belief. The butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is the idea that small changes in initial conditions can lead to vastly different outcomes in complex systems. It comes from chaos theory and was popularized by meteorologist Edward Lorenz, who discovered that tiny variations in atmospheric conditions could drastically alter weather predictions. The name comes from the poetic image. A butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil might set off a chain of events that causes a tornado in Texas. This principle challenges our intuitive belief that small causes produce small effects. In reality, many systems, weather patterns, ecosystems, economies, even human lives, are highly sensitive to small inputs. A minor decision like choosing one job over another might set off a sequence of events that alters your entire life. The butterfly effect also has philosophical implications, particularly regarding free will and determinism. If the future is shaped by countless small factors beyond our control, can we ever truly predict or control our destiny? It also raises questions about responsibility. If small actions can lead to massive consequences, how much control do we really have over outcomes? While the butterfly effect emphasizes unpredictability, it does not mean events are random. Instead, it highlights that even deterministic systems, where outcomes follow natural laws, can behave in ways that seem chaotic. This concept is widely used in physics, economics, psychology, and storytelling, suggesting that even the smallest actions might carry unimaginable significance. The Sorites paradox. The Sorites paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, challenges our understanding of vague concepts in gradual change. It asks, how many grains of sand make a heap? Imagine you have a heap of sand. If you remove one grain, it is still a heap. Remove another, and it's still a heap. But if you continue this process, eventually you're left with only a few grains. When did it stop being a heap? Conversely, if you start with one grain and add more, at what exact point does it become a heap? This paradox exposes the problem of vagueness in language. Many concepts, baldness, wealth, tallness, have no clear boundary. If a person loses hair gradually, when do they become bald? If you save a little money at a time, when do you become rich? These concepts rely on arbitrary thresholds rather than precise definitions. Philosophers have proposed several solutions. Fuzzy logic, which suggests that truth exists on a spectrum, not in binary terms. Approximate reasoning, which accepts vague boundaries but maintains practical utility, or the idea that language itself is naturally imprecise. Enforcing exact definitions on vague terms is a category error. The so-rights paradox has real-world implications. It applies to law. When does a minor crime become serious? Ethics. When does a lie become unacceptable? And identity. How much change can a person undergo and still be the same person? It forces us to confront the limits of human reasoning and challenges us to think more carefully about how we define the world around us. The lottery paradox. The lottery paradox is a philosophical puzzle that exposes contradictions in how we justify beliefs, particularly in situations involving probability. Introduced by Henry Keiberg, it challenges our understanding of rational belief and certainty. Imagine a fair lottery with 10,000 tickets and only one winning ticket. It seems rational to believe that any single ticket will lose, because the probability of losing is extremely high. If this reasoning applies to every ticket, then we must believe that all tickets will lose. But this contradicts the fact that one ticket must win. How can we rationally believe that each ticket will lose, while also knowing that one must win? This paradox highlights the tension between rationality and probability. We intuitively think that if something is very improbable, we are justified in believing it won't happen. But when this logic is applied universally, it leads to contradiction. It raises key questions in epistemology. Should rational belief be based purely on probability? Can we be justified in believing something that is not certain? One proposed solution is to redefine belief in probabilistic terms, arguing that belief should be seen as degrees of confidence rather than absolute truths. So we shouldn't fully believe that any single ticket will lose, only that it is extremely likely. The lottery paradox continues to influence discussions in logic, probability, and the nature of rational belief. Buridan's ass. Buridan's ass is a paradox about free will, decision-making, and rationality, named after the 14th century philosopher Jean Buridan. It illustrates a situation where pure rationality leads to an action. Imagine a donkey standing exactly between two identical piles of hay. The donkey, being perfectly rational, has no reason to prefer one pile over the other, since both options are equally desirable. Unable to make a decision, the donkey starves, caught in indecision despite having plenty. This paradox highlights a problem in deterministic decision-making. If every choice is based solely on reason and external factors, then in cases where all factors are equal, decision-making becomes impossible. It raises the question, is rationality enough for making decisions? Or do we need some form of spontaneity, randomness, or free will? Buridan's ass is relevant in philosophy, psychology, and artificial intelligence. It applies to human decisions too, when someone gets stuck between two equally appealing job offers or life paths. It also raises concerns for AI systems. And if an algorithm is purely rational, how would it resolve a conflict between two equal choices? One possible solution is to break the tie with an arbitrary choice, suggesting that intuition, randomness, or external influence plays a necessary role in real-world decision-making. While often presented as a playful thought experiment, Buridan's ass has deep implications for free will, determinism, and the limits of logical reasoning in practical life, metaethics. Do moral statements express facts or just opinions? Can we truly know what is right and wrong? One major debate in metaethics is between moral realism and moral anti-realism. Moral realists argue that moral truths exist independently of human beliefs, just as mathematical truths do. For example, murder is objectively wrong regardless of cultural or personal views. In contrast, moral anti-realists claim that morality is constructed by humans and has no objective existence outside of our perceptions. According to this view, moral rules are more like social agreements than universal truths. Another key debate is between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. Cognitivists believe that moral statements, e.g., stealing is wrong, express factual claims that can be true or false. Non-cognitivists, however, argue that moral statements are more like expressions of emotion or commands. When someone says stealing is wrong, they are not stating a fact but expressing disapproval or discouraging theft. Metaethics also examines how we justify moral beliefs. Are our moral values based on reason, emotions, or societal conventions? Some philosophers argue that morality is grounded in rational principles, while others believe it emerges from evolutionary and psychological factors. The study of metaethics is crucial because it influences how we approach ethical dilemmas. If morality is objective, then moral debates can have definitive answers. But if morality is subjective, ethical disagreements may never be fully resolvable. By questioning the foundations of moral reasoning, metaethics forces us to think deeply about what it really means to be good or bad. The argument from illusion. The argument from illusion is a philosophical problem that challenges the reliability of our senses by pointing out that perception is not always accurate. It suggests that if we sometimes experience illusions or hallucinations, then how can we ever be certain that our senses are telling us the truth? For example, when a stick is half submerged in water, it appears bent, even though it is actually straight. A distant object might look smaller than it really is. A mirage might make us see water where there is none. If our senses deceive us in these cases, how do we know they are not deceiving us all the time? This leads to a deeper question. Do we perceive reality as it truly is, or do we only experience distorted representations of it? This argument has been used by skeptics to question the possibility of absolute knowledge. René Descartes famously used a similar argument in his Meditations, suggesting that if our senses can mislead us, we should doubt all sensory-based knowledge. He extended this skepticism with the idea of an evil demon, a hypothetical being that could be deceiving us into believing a completely false reality. In response, indirect realists argue that we do not perceive the external world directly, but rather through mental representations of it. Idealists like George Berkeley go even further, claiming that reality itself is nothing more than perceptions in the mind. The argument from illusion remains relevant in modern philosophy and cognitive science. It ties into discussions about virtual reality, simulation theory, and the nature of consciousness. It raises the unsettling possibility that what we take as reality might just be an elaborate illusion, shaped by the limitations of our perception. The open question argument. The open question argument, proposed by G.E. Moore in his 1903 book, Principia Ethica, is a powerful critique of ethical naturalism. The idea that moral properties, such as good or right, can be defined in terms of natural properties like pleasure, survival, or evolutionary benefit. Moore argued that moral concepts cannot be reduced to empirical or scientific facts, because moral questions always remain open to further inquiry. His reasoning is simple. Suppose someone claims that good is the same as pleasure. We can then ask, is pleasure really good? If this question makes sense, then good and pleasure cannot be identical. Because if two terms are truly synonymous, questioning their equivalence would be meaningless. For example, asking, is a bachelor an unmarried man, feels trivial because the definitions are identical. But asking, is pleasure good, remains a legitimate and open question, meaning good cannot simply be defined as pleasure. This argument, now known as Moore's paradox, suggests that moral terms refer to something beyond physical or psychological facts. Moore believed that goodness is a simple, indefinable property, something we recognize intuitively, but cannot reduce to scientific explanations. The open question. Argument has had a lasting impact on ethics, pushing philosophers away from defining morality in purely naturalistic or scientific terms. It challenges any attempt to equate moral values with biology, psychology, or economics, suggesting that morality operates in a distinct and irreducible domain. However, critics argue that language evolves, and just because a question seems open does not mean it has no objective answer. The debate over whether morality is independent of natural facts continues to shape modern philosophy. The death of the author. The death of the author is a radical literary theory introduced by Roland Barthes in his 1967 essay of the same name. It challenges the idea that an author's intentions, biography, or personal meaning are the key to understanding a text. Barthes argues that once a work is created, the author's influence over its interpretation dies, leaving meaning entirely in the hands of the reader. Traditionally, literary criticism sought to uncover an author's intended meaning by analyzing their life, historical context, or psychological state. Barthes rejected this approach, claiming that focusing on the author's intent limits the richness of interpretation. Instead, he argued that texts do not have a single, fixed meaning. Meaning emerges through the interaction between the reader and the words on the page. In this view, literature is not about discovering what the author meant, but about exploring what the text does for the reader. Barthes' theory has profound implications for literature, art, and even philosophy. It suggests that works are independent entities, open to infinite interpretations, and that trying to find a single, authoritative meaning is misguided. This idea influenced postmodernism, deconstruction, and reader response theory, all of which emphasize the subjective experience of meaning rather than the creator's original intent. However, the death of the author is controversial. Critics argue that dismissing the author entirely ignores the historical and cultural context that shapes a work. Some also point out that many authors deliberately encode specific meanings into their texts. While Barthes' idea is extreme, it raises an important question. Should we judge a work by what the author intended, or by what it means to us? Whether one agrees with Barthes or not, his argument remains one of the most influential challenges to traditional literary interpretation, reshaping how we think about meaning, authorship, and the role of the reader. The identity of indiscernibles. The identity of indiscernibles is a principle in metaphysics proposed by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. It states that if two entities share all their properties, then they must be the same entity. In other words, if there's no way to distinguish between two objects, even in theory, then they are not truly separate, but are one and the same. Leibniz formulated this principle in response to philosophical debates about identity and difference. If two things are truly distinct, there must be at least one characteristic that sets them apart. If no such difference exists, then they are identical. This principle is often summed up as, no two things can be exactly alike in all respects and still be distinct. This idea has deep implications in logic, metaphysics, and even physics. In classical philosophy, it suggests that individuality is based on unique properties, rather than mere existence. However, in quantum mechanics, the principle is challenged by particles like electrons, which appear to be completely identical and indistinguishable. Some interpretations suggest that, at a fundamental level, identity may not work the way we intuitively think it does. A related concept is Leibniz's law, which states, if two things are identical, then whatever is true of one must be true of the other. This forms the basis of many logical and philosophical arguments about identity, especially in discussions of personal identity, time, and the nature of objects. The identity of indiscernibles forces us to ask, what truly makes something unique? Is identity based on intrinsic properties, or do we impose distinctions through perception and language? These questions remain central to contemporary philosophy, particularly in debates about the nature of reality and individuality. The hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers to describe the deepest and most perplexing question in the philosophy of mind. Why and how does physical brain activity give rise to subjective experience? While neuroscience has made great progress in understanding the mechanisms of the brain, how neurons fire, how perception works, how memories are stored, these are often referred to as the easy problems of consciousness. The hard problem, however, goes beyond function and asks, why do we experience things at all? Why does seeing red feel like something? Why does pain hurt rather than just being a neutral signal processed in the brain? This issue is particularly troubling for materialism, the idea that everything, including the mind, is purely physical. If the brain is just a biological machine, why does it generate an internal, subjective reality? Could a sufficiently advanced robot, built with circuits instead of neurons, ever experience consciousness the way humans do? Or would it just behave as if it were conscious without truly feeling anything? Some theories attempt to explain consciousness as an emergent property, suggesting that when a system reaches a certain level of complexity, consciousness naturally arises. Others, such as panpsychism, argue that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, present even in the smallest particles. Despite decades of research, the hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved. It raises profound questions about free will, artificial intelligence, and the nature of reality itself. If we cannot explain why we experience the world the way we do, we may still be far from understanding what it truly means to be human. The Gaia hypothesis. The Gaia hypothesis is the idea that the Earth and its biological systems function as a single, self-regulating organism that maintains conditions favorable for life. Proposed by James Lovelock in the 1970s, the hypothesis suggests that life itself plays an active role in stabilizing the environment, such as regulating temperature, atmospheric composition, and ocean salinity, ensuring that Earth remains habitable over long periods. Lovelock's theory challenges the traditional view that life simply adapts to the environment. Instead, he argues that life actively shapes its surroundings. For example, Earth's atmosphere contains a much higher concentration of oxygen than expected from geological processes alone. This is due to photosynthetic organisms, which continuously produce oxygen, maintaining a stable balance that supports life. Similarly, ocean salinity has remained within narrow limits for hundreds of millions of years, despite natural erosion that should have made the oceans too salty for life. Lovelock suggests that biological processes help regulate these levels. While the Gaia hypothesis is sometimes misunderstood as implying that Earth is conscious or alive, Lovelock clarified that it is not about mystical beliefs, but about complex systems and feedback loops. However, the hypothesis has been controversial. Critics argue that evolution operates on individual organisms, not entire planets, and that life doesn't intentionally regulate the environment. Even so, some aspects of Gaia theory have been incorporated into modern Earth system science, climate studies, and discussions on how human activity disrupts natural balance. The Gaia hypothesis forces us to rethink our relationship with the planet, not as passive inhabitants, but as part of an interconnected system where life and environment continuously shape each other. Whether fully accepted or not, it has influenced discussions on climate change, sustainability, and the fragile balance that allows Earth to remain a living world. The free rider problem. The free rider problem is a classic issue in economics, ethics, and political philosophy. It occurs when individuals benefit from a shared resource or service without contributing to its cost or maintenance. It highlights the challenge of collective action. How do we ensure that everyone plays their part in supporting public goods when people have an incentive to let others carry the burden? A common example is public transportation. If a city funds buses through taxes rather than fares, some people may avoid paying taxes but still use the buses. Similarly, in a workplace team project, some members may put in less effort, knowing that others will complete the work. In national defense, all citizens benefit from security, whether or not they actively support or fund the military. So, the key issue is that when too many people try to free ride, the system collapses. If no one pays for public transport, it cannot function. The free rider problem is closely related to the tragedy of the commons, where individuals overuse a shared resource, such as overfishing in the ocean, because they assume others will manage it responsibly. It also connects to game theory, particularly the prisoner's dilemma, where individuals acting in self-interest can lead to worse outcomes for everyone. Solutions to the free rider problem include taxation, laws, and incentives. Governments impose taxes to fund public goods, while organizations use rewards or penalties to encourage participation. Some societies rely on social norms, such as peer pressure or moral responsibility, to ensure cooperation. The free rider problem remains a major challenge in issues like climate change. Why should one country cut emissions if others won't? And voting. Why should I vote if my single vote doesn't decide the election? Understanding this problem helps explain why collective action is difficult and why human cooperation often requires more than just rational self-interest. The simulation hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis proposes that reality as we know it may be a highly advanced computer simulation, rather than a fundamental physical reality. Philosopher Nick Bostrom popularized this idea by arguing that if technological civilizations progress far enough, they could create realistic, simulated worlds that include conscious beings, unaware that they are part of a simulation. Bostrom's argument is based on probability. He suggests that at least one of the following must be true. 1. Civilizations never reach the stage of creating advanced simulations due to self-destruction or technological limits. 2. Civilizations reach that stage but choose not to run simulations. 3. We are almost certainly living in a simulation. If a civilization were capable of creating realistic, simulated beings, it would likely create many such simulations, possibly billions. If this were the case, the number of simulated beings would vastly outnumber real ones, meaning that, statistically, we are more likely to be simulated than real. The simulation hypothesis raises deep questions about free will, consciousness, and the nature of reality. If we are in a simulation, could we ever break out? Would the simulator be a godlike entity? Could entire universes be simulated within other simulations, creating an infinite chain of realities? Critics argue that the hypothesis is unfalsifiable, meaning it cannot be proven or disproven, making it scientifically meaningless. Others suggest that even if we are simulated, it makes no practical difference since the simulation would still follow consistent rules we perceive as physics. Regardless of its validity, the simulation hypothesis forces us to rethink our fundamental understanding of existence. If we were in a simulation, how would we even know? And if we discovered the truth, would it change anything? Skepticism. Skepticism is the philosophical position that doubts the certainty of knowledge, questioning whether we can truly know anything with absolute confidence. It challenges assumptions about reality, perception, and belief, pushing us to reconsider how we acquire knowledge and whether our senses can be trusted. One of the earliest skeptics, Pyrrho of Elis, argued that humans should suspend judgment on all matters, as certainty is unattainable. Later, René Descartes introduced radical skepticism, doubting even the existence of the external world. He proposed the famous thought experiment of an evil demon, a hypothetical being that could be deceiving us into believing in a false reality. Descartes resolved this with one undeniable truth: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Even if he was being deceived, the fact that he doubted proved his existence as a thinking being. Skepticism has influenced countless areas of philosophy, from epistemology to ethics, and remains a powerful tool in scientific inquiry, where doubt leads to further questioning and deeper understanding. Yet taken too far, skepticism can become paralyzing, leading to nihilism or inaction. So the challenge becomes, how do we balance healthy doubt with practical belief? I think, therefore I am. Even doubting itself proves the existence of a conscious thinker. Skepticism manifests in multiple ways. Empirical skepticism questions whether our senses provide reliable information, given that illusions and hallucinations can mislead us. Moral skepticism challenges the notion of objective moral truths, suggesting morality may be a human construct rather than an absolute standard. Religious skepticism critically examines claims about gods, miracles, and supernatural events, often demanding empirical evidence before accepting such beliefs. Skepticism plays a vital role in science, philosophy, and daily reasoning. It encourages the demand for evidence, logical consistency, and critical thinking. However, extreme skepticism can lead to solipsism, the belief that only one's own mind is certain to exist, making meaningful engagement with reality difficult. Philosophers such as David Hume advocated for moderate skepticism, arguing that while certainty is impossible, we can still form rational beliefs based on probability and experience. This balance between doubt and pragmatism allows for questioning assumptions while still engaging with reality. Skepticism remains central in modern debates about misinformation, scientific theories, and conspiracy beliefs, reminding us that questioning is valuable, but also that at some point we must act on reasonable evidence, even if absolute certainty remains unattainable. Inar, eternalism versus presentism. The debate between eternalism and presentism concerns the nature of time and existence. Eternalism holds that all moments, past, present, and future, exist equally. Presentism, on the other hand, argues that only the present moment is real, with the past being gone and the future not yet existing. Eternalism is often compared to a block universe, where time is like a fourth dimension, similar to space. Just as different locations exist simultaneously, all points in time exist at once, even if we only experience one at a time. This view aligns with Einstein's theory of relativity, which suggests that time is not absolute, but relative to the observer. If all moments exist, then concepts like fate and determinism gain significance, as the future is already out there in some sense. Presentism, in contrast, argues that only the present moment is real. The past no longer exists and the future is yet to be determined. This aligns more with common sense. Events fade into memory and the future remains unknown. Critics argue that presentism struggles to explain the flow of time in a scientifically rigorous way. This debate remains unresolved, raising fundamental questions about free will, destiny, and whether time is something we move through or merely an illusion of perception. It looks like the unpunctuated script wasn't saved or uploaded as a file, which caused an error during processing. To proceed, I can directly format the last batch of your text here with punctuation for a smooth, engaging voiceover delivery. The Mereological paradox. The Mereological paradox arises from the philosophical study of mereology, which examines how parts relate to wholes. It questions whether objects are truly distinct from their components, or whether they are merely a collection of their parts. This paradox challenges our basic assumptions about identity, composition, and what it means for something to exist as a whole rather than just as the sum of its parts. One famous mereological puzzle is the ship of Theseus. If all the parts of a ship are gradually replaced, is it still the same ship? And if the old parts are reassembled into another ship, which one is the real ship of Theseus? Mereology forces us to ask, do objects retain their identity through change, or do they become entirely new entities? Another issue is mereological nihilism, the radical view that composite objects do not truly exist. Only the smallest indivisible parts do. According to this view, things like tables and people are just convenient labels for collections of particles rather than real entities. The mereological paradox highlights deep problems in ontology and identity. If objects are just their parts, then what makes a whole more than just a collection? And if objects are more than their parts, what defines their unity? These questions remain central to modern metaphysics. Quietism. Quietism is a philosophical stance that suggests many philosophical problems arise from misunderstandings of language or thought, and that the best response is to stop engaging in such debates altogether. Instead of seeking ultimate answers, quietism encourages a detached, almost passive approach to philosophical inquiry, arguing that many disputes are meaningless or unresolvable. Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the most famous quietists, believed that philosophical problems often stem from misusing language. In his later work, he argued that instead of trying to solve deep metaphysical or epistemological questions, we should recognize that they emerge from confusion about how language functions. For example, debates about whether free will or the self exist might dissolve if we simply recognize that different contexts give these terms different meanings. Quietism also appears in ethical and religious traditions, such as Taoism in certain Buddhist schools, where the emphasis is on inner peace, non-attachment, and avoiding unnecessary intellectual struggle. Rather than searching for ultimate truths, quietists accept the limits of human knowledge and focus on how we live and communicate. Critics argue that quietism is overly passive, avoiding rather than resolving important issues. However, its defenders claim that many philosophical problems only seem deep because they are phrased in misleading ways. Whether seen as a path to wisdom or an escape from difficult questions, quietism remains an influential response to philosophy's grandest puzzles. The paradox of choice. The paradox of choice is the idea that while having choices is generally seen as a good thing, too many choices can lead to anxiety, indecision, and dissatisfaction. Psychologist Barry Schwartz popularized this concept, arguing that an overabundance of options can actually make people less happy, not more free. In a world with limitless choices, whether in careers, relationships, consumer goods, or life decisions, people often feel overwhelmed. Instead of feeling liberated, they experience decision paralysis, where they struggle to make a choice at all. Even when they do decide, they may suffer from regret or FOMO, fear of missing out, worrying that they made the wrong decision and could have chosen something better. Schwartz distinguishes between two types of decision makers: maximizers, those who try to find the absolute best option. They compare every possibility and often feel dissatisfied, even if their choice was objectively good. Satisficers, those who settle for a choice that is good enough. They tend to be more content and less anxious. This suggests that learning to accept good enough can be psychologically healthier than always striving for the perfect choice. The paradox of choice has implications for economics, mental health, and everyday decision-making. It raises an important question: is more freedom always better, or does simplicity lead to greater happiness? Sometimes fewer choices may actually mean a more fulfilling life. The Copernican principle. The Copernican principle is the idea that humans do not occupy a privileged or special position in the universe. Named after Nicholas Copernicus, who demonstrated that the Earth orbits the Sun rather than being the center of the cosmos, this principle suggests that our place in the universe is likely unremarkable. Historically, people believed that Earth was the center of everything. Copernicus's model shattered this assumption, showing that Earth is just one planet among many. This idea has been extended to modern cosmology, implying that our solar system, galaxy, and even our observable universe are not uniquely special, but rather part of a vast, indifferent cosmos. The principle has profound implications in astronomy, suggesting that if life emerged on Earth, it is likely to exist elsewhere. In philosophy, it challenges human exceptionalism and raises questions about our significance. It also supports the mediocrity principle, which states that Earth and humanity are probably average rather than unique. However, the Copernican principle also has limits. Some argue that Earth does seem unusual in its ability to support complex life, suggesting that our position may not be entirely random. Still, this principle continues to shape scientific thought, reminding us that the universe is vast, and we may not be as central to it as we once believed. Socratic irony. Socratic irony is a rhetorical technique used by Socrates, in which he pretends to be ignorant or humble in order to expose contradictions in someone else's beliefs. It is a form of feigned ignorance that forces an opponent to critically examine their own ideas, often leading them to realize they do not understand what they thought they did. Socrates would engage in dialogue by asking seemingly innocent questions, pretending not to know the answer. His opponents, believing themselves wise, would confidently explain their views. However, through further questioning, Socrates would reveal contradictions or flaws in their reasoning. The person would eventually reach a point where they had no choice but to admit their ignorance. Hence, Socrates' famous claim, "I know that I know nothing." This technique is central to the Socratic method, a teaching style that encourages critical thinking through persistent questioning. It remains a foundation of philosophical inquiry, law, and education. Socratic irony can be seen as both a teaching tool and a subtle form of intellectual trap. While it encourages self-reflection, it can also frustrate opponents, making them feel humiliated rather than enlightened. Despite this, it remains one of the most powerful methods of revealing the limits of knowledge. The naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy is a logical mistake in ethical reasoning, where people assume that what is natural is automatically good or right. The term was introduced by G.E. Moore in his book Principia Ethica, where he argued that one cannot define moral values purely based on natural properties like pleasure, survival, or evolutionary success. This fallacy often appears in arguments like, because humans evolved to eat meat, eating meat is morally right, or because aggression exists in nature, it must be acceptable. However, just because something occurs naturally does not mean it is ethically justified. Diseases, suffering, and violence are also natural, yet we do not consider them good. Unknowing. The fallacy highlights a key distinction between descriptive statements, what is, and prescriptive statements, what ought to be. Just because something happens in nature does not mean it should happen in society. Ethics requires additional reasoning beyond what is simply natural. This fallacy remains relevant in modern debates on morality, politics, and science. It reminds us that nature is not necessarily a moral guide, and that ethical principles must be evaluated on their own merits, not just on what appears natural. The evil demon hypothesis. The evil demon hypothesis is a radical skepticism thought experiment introduced by René Descartes to question the reliability of human perception and knowledge. Descartes proposed the idea that a powerful, malevolent being, an evil demon, could be deceiving us, making us believe in a false reality. In this scenario, everything we perceive, our senses, our memories, even our logical reasoning, could be manipulated by this deceptive entity. If such a demon existed, how could we ever be certain that anything we believe is true? This hypothesis serves as a foundation for Descartes' method of hyperbolic doubt, where he systematically doubts everything in search of absolute certainty. The only thing that survives this extreme skepticism is the statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Even if the demon is deceiving Descartes, there must still be a thinking entity being deceived. This realization provides the first unshakable foundation for knowledge, the evil demon. Hypothesis remains influential in discussions of skepticism, consciousness, and artificial reality. It has inspired modern variations such as the brain in a vat thought experiment and the simulation hypothesis, both of which challenge our ability to verify reality beyond our subjective experience. Hume's guillotine. Hume's guillotine, also known as the is-ought problem, is a principle introduced by philosopher David Hume. It argues that one cannot logically derive moral or prescriptive statements, what ought to be, from purely factual or descriptive statements. What is? Hume observed that many philosophers transition from describing how the world works to prescribing how it should work, without adequate justification. For example, someone might say, people have always engaged in warfare, therefore war is natural and should not be avoided. Hume points out that this reasoning is flawed. Just because something happens doesn't mean it should happen. This principle has had a profound impact on ethics and moral philosophy, suggesting that moral values cannot be deduced directly from nature or science alone. There must be an additional ethical framework or line of reasoning that bridges the gap between facts and values. Hume's guillotine forces us to critically examine moral claims and to ask, are they based on sound reasoning, or are they just assumptions derived from observations? Modern debates in ethics, law, and political philosophy still grapple with this issue. It serves as a powerful reminder. Morality requires more than just appealing what already exists. It demands thoughtful justification for what should exist. The no true Scotsman fallacy. The no true Scotsman fallacy is a logical fallacy in which someone redefines a category in an ad hoc way to dismiss counterexamples that disprove their original claim. Rather than acknowledging that their statement might be flawed, they shift the definition to protect their belief. The name comes from an example. Someone claims no Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. When presented with a counterexample, but my friend Angus is a Scotsman and he puts sugar on his porridge, the response is, well, no true Scotsman does that. Instead of adjusting the claim, the speaker redefines Scotsman to exclude Angus, thereby avoiding contradiction without offering real evidence. This fallacy is especially common in ideological debates. For instance, no real gamer plays mobile games. No true patriot criticizes their country. When challenged with counterexamples, believers often move the goalposts, dismissing them as not true members of the group. The no true Scotsman fallacy highlights a key problem: manipulating definitions to avoid genuine critique. It shuts down debate, undermines intellectual honesty, and avoids engaging with opposing evidence. Recognizing this fallacy helps us maintain fair and open discussions, ones where truth is pursued, not protected by shifting definitions. Moore's paradox. Moore's paradox, introduced by philosopher G.E. Moore, refers to a strange kind of contradiction that arises when someone makes a statement like, "It is raining, but I don't believe it is raining." At first glance, there is nothing logically wrong with this statement. It's possible for it to rain while someone doesn't believe it. but it is epistemically absurd because asserting something typically implies you believe it. Saying both things at once reveals a conflict between the speaker's assertion and their belief. This paradox raises deep questions about self-awareness, belief, and rationality. For example, if someone says, "I am in pain, but I don't believe I am in pain," we instinctively recognize something is off, not because of logic, but because of a conflict in mental states. Moore's paradox is important in the philosophy of mind, language, and epistemology. It challenges how we understand belief, showing that our internal attitudes need to be coherent, not just our logical structures. Psychologically, the paradox connects to cognitive dissonance, holding conflicting thoughts or beliefs, and it has implications for mental health, rational decision-making, and even AI reasoning systems. In essence, Moore's paradox helps us grasp the subtle yet profound link between what we say, what we believe, and what it means to be consistent in thought. The paradox of tolerance. The paradox of tolerance, introduced by philosopher Karl Popper, states that if a society is tolerant without limit, it risks being destroyed by the intolerant. In other words, allowing unrestricted freedom to those who promote hatred, violence, or oppressive ideologies can ultimately undermine and even eliminate the very freedoms that tolerance is meant to protect. Popper argued that a tolerant society must be prepared to defend itself by refusing to tolerate intolerance when it becomes dangerous. If intolerant groups are given free rein to dismantle democratic values, they can exploit freedom of speech and open discourse to gain power, and then suppress others. This paradox sparks difficult questions. Should hate speech be protected as free speech? Where do we draw the line between protecting diverse opinions and preventing harm? Can we uphold liberty by limiting it in certain cases? The paradox of tolerance is central to modern debates about censorship, hate speech laws, and political extremism. It reminds us that absolute openness can be self-defeating, and that safeguarding tolerance sometimes requires drawing boundaries. It's a delicate balance. Defend pluralism, but not at the cost of enabling those who would destroy it. Russell's paradox. Russell's paradox, discovered by philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell in 1901, exposed a major inconsistency in Earth-set theory, the mathematical study of collections of objects. The paradox asks a seemingly simple question: does the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contain itself? If it does contain itself, then it shouldn't, because it only contains sets that do not contain themselves. But if it does not contain itself, then it must, because it qualifies as a set that does not contain itself. This creates a contradiction, a self-referential loop, where the set both must and must not contain itself. To illustrate the concept, imagine this version. A barber shaves everyone in town who does not shave themselves. The question is, does the barber shave himself? If he does, he shouldn't. If he doesn't, then he should. Either way, we hit a contradiction. Russell's paradox revealed a flaw in the naive set theory of the time, which assumed that any definable collection could form a set. This led to the development of more robust logical systems, such as Zermelo-Fraenkel's set theory, to prevent such contradictions. Beyond mathematics, Russell's paradox has influenced logic, computer science, philosophy, and artificial intelligence, especially in areas involving self-reference and logical consistency. It's a classic example of how even basic assumptions, when examined deeply, can unravel the entire logical system built on top of them. The paradox of omnipotence. The paradox of omnipotence challenges the very notion of an all-powerful being. It is typically phrased like this: can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that it cannot lift it? If the being can create such a rock, then there is something it cannot do: lift the rock. If it cannot create the rock, then there is something it cannot do: create it. Either way, the concept of being all-powerful seems to break down. This paradox raises deep questions about the limits of power, logical consistency, and even the nature of divine attributes. Philosophers and theologians have offered various responses. Thomas Aquinas argued that omnipotence refers to the power to do all things that are logically possible. In this view, a logically contradictory task, like creating a square circle or a rock too heavy to lift, is not a real thing that can be done, and so doesn't count against omnipotence. C.S. Lewis reinforced this idea by suggesting that nonsense remains nonsense, even when we talk about God. Creating a task that defies logic isn't a measure of power, it's a misuse of language. The paradox of omnipotence remains a powerful thought experiment, particularly in the philosophy of religion, logic, and metaphysics. It challenges us to refine our definitions and confront the complexities hidden within seemingly simple words like all-powerful. The prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a foundational concept in game theory and decision-making, illustrating how rational individuals might make choices that lead to worse outcomes for everyone involved, simply because they can't trust each other. Imagine two criminals arrested and held in separate cells. Each is offered a deal. If one betrays the other and the other stays silent, the betrayer goes free and the silent one gets the harshest sentence. If both betray each other, they both get a moderate sentence. If both remain silent, they each receive a light sentence. From an individual perspective, betrayal seems like the best choice, regardless of what the other person does. But if both betray, they both end up worse off than if they had cooperated. This dilemma reveals a key insight. Acting in one's own interest doesn't always lead to the best collective outcome. It explains why. Countries struggle to disarm, even when peace would benefit all. Businesses engage in price wars that reduce profits for everyone. People avoid paying taxes or voting, assuming others will do their part. Yet the repeated version of the dilemma offers hope. When individuals expect ongoing interactions, trust and cooperation can emerge as the most beneficial long-term strategy. The prisoner's dilemma serves as a powerful metaphor for human behavior, showing tension between self-interest and collective good, and why trust and communication are so essential in any society. The lottery fallacy. The lottery fallacy occurs when someone assumes that an event is so improbable, it must be impossible, or rigged if it actually happens. For example, when someone wins the lottery, skeptics might say, the odds were millions to one, it must be a setup. But that reasoning is flawed. While the chance of any particular person winning is low, the chance that someone wins is actually quite high, especially with millions of participants. This fallacy confuses improbability with impossibility, and it shows up in many areas of life. Conspiracy theories. People doubt official stories simply because the events seem too unlikely. Skepticism about evolution. Critics argue complex life is too improbable to arise by chance, ignoring vast timescales and mutations, or mistrust of coincidences. A rare event is assumed to require a hidden cause. Understanding the lottery fallacy helps us accept that improbable things do happen, and that randomness and statistics can explain a lot more than we think. It reminds us to separate emotional disbelief from mathematical reality, and to think critically when faced with unlikely, but not impossible, events. The problem of the criterion. The problem of the criterion, introduced by philosopher Roderick Chisholm, is a fundamental dilemma in epistemology, the study of knowledge. It asks, how can we know which beliefs are true? And how do we know which methods are reliable for finding truth? Here's the problem. To know if a belief is true, we need a reliable method. But to know if a method is reliable, we need to already know that some beliefs are true. This creates a circular problem. We need a method to identify truth, but we need truth to validate the method. There are three main responses. 1. Methodism. Start by defining a trustworthy method for finding knowledge and use it to test beliefs. 2. Particularism. Start by assuming we already know certain things and build our method based on those. 3. Skepticism. Claim that since the problem cannot be resolved, we cannot truly know anything for certain. This dilemma forces us to confront the limits of justification. Do we build knowledge from the top down or bottom up? Do we ever reach a foundation or just keep going in circles? The problem of the criterion remains a powerful reminder that even the process of knowing requires careful scrutiny, and that certainty is far more elusive than it seems. Hume's problem of miracles. David Hume, the 18th century philosopher, posed a powerful challenge to belief in miracles in his work, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. He defined a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature, something that contradicts all our prior experience. His core question: should we ever believe that a miracle has occurred? Hume argued, probably not. His reasoning is based on probability. Natural laws are supported by countless consistent observations. Fire burns. People don't rise from the dead. Water doesn't turn into wine. So when someone claims a miracle, Hume suggests it's far more likely that the person was mistaken, deceived, or exaggerating, than that the laws of nature were actually broken. He also pointed out that miracle reports often come from distant places, ancient times, or emotionally charged religious settings. This makes them less reliable, especially given human tendencies toward bias, storytelling, and wishful thinking. Hume's problem of miracles doesn't say miracles are impossible. Instead, it says that the evidence for them is always weaker than the evidence against them. Believing in a miracle requires a level of proof so extraordinary it almost never holds up. This argument still fuels debates in religion, science, and critical thinking, reminding us that extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence. The infinite regress problem. The infinite regress problem is a fundamental issue in philosophy, particularly in epistemology, metaphysics, and logic. It occurs when an explanation or justification requires a previous explanation, which requires another, and so on, forever. Take the question, how do you know X is true? You might answer, because of reason Y. But then we could ask, how do you know Y is true? And this chain of questioning can continue infinitely. This leads to a dilemma. If we keep requiring further justification, we end up in an infinite regress. If we stop somewhere, we may be accused of assuming something without justification. There are three main responses. 1. Foundationalism. Claims that some beliefs are self-evident or basic and don't require further justification. These form the foundation for other beliefs. 2. Coherentism. Argues that beliefs can support each other in a web-like structure rather than a linear chain. There's no foundation, just mutual support. 3. Infinitism. Accepts infinite regress and claims that infinite chains of reasoning can still be meaningful. This is the least popular and most radical solution. The infinite regress problem pushes us to ask, where does our knowledge stop? It challenges the idea that we can ever achieve absolute certainty, showing that every justification might itself need justifying. The Raven Paradox. The Raven Paradox, proposed by philosopher Carl Gustav Hempel, challenges how we confirm general statements through observation, especially in the context of scientific reasoning. So let's start with a general claim: all ravens are black. Now, if you observe a black raven, it clearly supports this claim. But by the rules of logic, the statement, all ravens are black, is logically equivalent to implying all non-black things are not ravens. This means that seeing a green apple, which is a non-black thing and not a raven, also confirms the original statement. That leads to the strange conclusion. Observing a red apple supports the idea that all ravens are black. This seems absurd, even though it follows valid logic. The paradox highlights the tension between logical equivalence and intuitive or scientific confirmation. Some philosophers respond by saying not all confirmations should be treated equally. Relevance and context matter. Just because something is logically related doesn't mean it contributes meaningful scientific evidence. The Raven Paradox remains a fascinating problem in the philosophy of science, showing how inductive reasoning, the basis of many scientific methods, can lead to surprising and unintuitive results. The Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a psychological phenomenon where people with low ability in a particular area tend to overestimate their competence, while those with high ability often underestimate theirs. This cognitive bias was identified by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger in 1999. They found that people who lack knowledge or skill in a domain often don't know enough to recognize their own limitations. As a result, they believe they are more competent than they actually are. On the flip side, people who are truly knowledgeable tend to be more aware of what they don't know, making them more humble about their abilities. In essence, incompetent people are often overconfident. Competent people are often underconfident. This effect shows up in many areas. In workplaces where unqualified individuals may take leadership roles. In politics where people speak confidently about issues they don't understand. In education where students may believe they've mastered material they've only skimmed. Overcoming the Dunning-Kruger effect requires self-awareness, critical feedback, and a willingness to learn continuously. It's a powerful reminder that true wisdom begins with recognizing the limits of your knowledge. The Munchausen trilemma. The Munchausen trilemma is a philosophical problem that shows the impossibility of proving any truth or belief with absolute certainty. It is named after Baron Munchausen, a fictional character who claimed to have pulled himself out of a swamp by his own hair, an impossible feat. Similarly, the trilemma suggests that attempts to justify knowledge inevitably lead to one of three unsatisfactory outcomes. 1. Infinite regress. Every justification needs another justification, and that one needs another, and so on, forever. This endless chain never provides a final, stable foundation for knowledge. 2. Circular reasoning. A belief is supported by another belief that eventually refers back to the original, creating a loop. For example, this source is reliable because I read it from a reliable source. This is logically weak and unconvincing. 3. Axiomatic assumption. Some statements are simply accepted without proof. For instance, we just know this is true. While this avoids infinite regress, it offers no real justification. It's a leap of faith. The Munchausen trilemma highlights a major challenge in epistemology, the study of knowledge. It forces us to ask, can we ever truly justify what we believe? Or must we always rest our beliefs on assumptions that themselves lack proof? Some philosophers respond by embracing foundationalism, accepting basic beliefs as self-evident, coherentism, allowing beliefs to support each other in a web, or infinitism, accepting infinite chains of reasoning as valid. The trilemma doesn't offer a solution, but it does remind us that the search for absolute certainty may be fundamentally flawed. Mereological nihilism. Mereological nihilism is a radical metaphysical view that denies the existence of composite objects. According to this position, only the most basic, indivisible parts of matter, called simples, truly exist. What we think of as objects, tables, trees, people, are merely convenient labels for collections of particles. For example, when we refer to a chair, we're not identifying a single object, but rather a grouping of atoms arranged in a certain pattern. The chair as a whole does not exist, only the particles do. This view challenges common sense in our everyday experience. After all, we interact with chairs, cars, and people constantly, but mereological nihilists argue that these interactions are conceptual shortcuts, not reflections of reality. Implications: personal identity. If a person is just a bundle of particles, can we speak meaningfully about the self or the soul? Objects' boundaries. Where does one object end and another begin if everything is just arrangements of particles? Ontology. It raises a deeper question. What does it mean for something to exist? Alternatives. Mereological universalism. The view that any collection of parts forms an object, so even a rock and a cloud together could be considered a single object. Mereological nihilism. The strict denial of any composite objects, only particles exist. While controversial, mereological nihilism remains influential in debates about identity, composition, and existence, and forces us to reconsider whether wholes are more than just the sum of their parts. The tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons describes a situation in which individuals, acting in their own self-interest, overuse and deplete a shared resource, ultimately harming everyone, including themselves. This concept was popularized by ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968. Imagine a group of farmers who share a communal pasture. Each farmer gains more by adding extra animals to graze. But if every farmer does this, the pasture becomes overgrazed and destroyed. What benefits one in the short term harms all in the long term. This logic applies to many real-world issues. Overfishing depletes oceans. Deforestation destroys ecosystems. Carbon emissions cause climate change. Traffic congestion worsens when too many drive. The tragedy arises because the cost is shared, but the benefit is individual. Solutions: government regulation. Laws to limit usage, for example, emission caps, fishing quotas. Privatization, assigning ownership to create accountability. Community-based management, local stewardship, where communities manage resources sustainably. Relevance. It shows the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility, and why some level of cooperation, enforcement, or moral obligation is necessary to preserve shared goods. The tragedy of the commons is a warning. Without coordination, shared resources can collapse, no matter how rational individual actions may seem. Panpsychism. Panpsychism is the philosophical view that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the universe. According to this idea, everything, from electrons to rocks to entire galaxies, possesses some form of mental experience or proto-consciousness, even if it's incredibly basic. Unlike materialism, which asserts that consciousness emerges only from complex physical systems like brains, panpsychism suggests that consciousness doesn't need to be produced. It's already built into the fabric of reality. Historical roots. Panpsychism isn't new. It has roots in ancient Eastern philosophy, for example, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Stoicism. Baruch Spinoza's monism, where God and nature are one and everything has a mental aspect. Modern revival. Philosophers like Galileo, Bertrand Russell, and more recently, Philip Goff and David Chalmers have revived panpsychism to address the hard problem of consciousness. Why and how subjective experience arises from physical processes. If everything is made of matter, why do some arrangements, like a human brain, produce experience, while others, like a rock, seemingly do not? Panpsychism answers, maybe everything has experience in some form, and brains merely host a more complex version of it, your variance. Micropsychism, the idea that fundamental particles like electrons and quarks have very simple forms of consciousness. Cosmopsychism, the entire universe is a single conscious entity, and our minds are fragments of it. Criticism. It's often labeled unscientific or unfalsifiable, as it's difficult to test. Critics ask, if particles are conscious, how do their experiences combine into unified human consciousness? This is known as the combination problem. Still, panpsychism offers an alternative to both dualism and materialism, suggesting that mind is as fundamental as matter or energy. If true, it could radically reshape how we understand consciousness, intelligence, and even what it means to be alive. Terror management theory. Terror management theory, TMT, is a psychological and philosophical framework that explores how humans cope with the knowledge of their own mortality. Developed by psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pijinski, TMT suggests that a significant portion of human behavior is motivated by the fear of death, a fear that we often manage without even realizing it. Unlike animals, humans possess self-awareness, which means we can imagine the future, including the inevitability of our own death. This creates existential anxiety, a deep-rooted terror that can influence our beliefs, actions, and worldviews. How we cope. To manage this fear, we cling to cultural worldviews, belief systems, and personal achievements that give life meaning. These offer a sense of symbolic immortality, the belief that we will continue to exist in some way after death. Religion promises an afterlife. Nationalism offers identity and purpose. Legacy building, like art, children, or fame, gives us a sense of permanence. Key findings. Experiments show that reminders of mortality, known as mortality salience, cause people to become more defensive of their cultural values, exhibit stronger in-group loyalty and more hostility toward outsiders, engage in more conformist or pro-social behavior. Our implications. TMT helps explain a wide range of phenomena: religious belief and martyrdom, nationalism and extremism, consumer behavior, buying products to feel significant or secure, the pursuit of self-esteem as a buffer against mortality anxiety, criticism. While supported by many studies, critics argue that TMT overemphasizes death anxiety and that not all cultural behavior stems from fear. Some suggest alternative theories, like attachment theory or self-determination theory, as better explanations for human motivation. Still, terror management theory remains a powerful lens for understanding how the awareness of death shapes human culture, politics, morality, and identity, often beneath the surface of everyday life. The anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is a philosophical concept that explores the relationship between human existence and the structure of the universe. At its core, it addresses a profound question. Why does the universe appear to be fine-tuned to support life, especially intelligent human life? Two main versions. 1. Weak anthropic principle, WAP. This version simply states that the universe must be compatible with the conscious beings that observe it. In other words, we can observe the universe the way it is because we exist. If the universe weren't life-permitting, we wouldn't be here to ask these questions. 2. Strong anthropic principle, SAP. This goes a step further, suggesting that the universe must have properties that allow life to develop at some point. Some interpretations imply that the universe is in some way designed or destined to produce life or consciousness. The fine-tuning puzzle. Physicists have discovered that many fundamental constants, like the strength of gravity, the mass of particles, or the rate of cosmic expansion, fall within very narrow ranges that make life possible. So, if these values were even slightly different, stars wouldn't form, chemistry wouldn't work, and life as we know it wouldn't exist. This raises the question, is this an incredible coincidence, the result of necessity, or evidence of design? Possible explanations. Chance. We just got lucky. Out of all the possible combinations, this one happened to support life. Multiverse theory. There are countless universes with different physical laws. We happen to be in one of the rare universes that supports life, because only in such a universe could observers evolve to notice it. Design or purpose. Some take the fine-tuning as evidence of a creator or intelligent designer who made the universe suitable for life. Selection. Bias. The anthropic principle may be tautological. We can only ask these questions in a universe where asking is possible. Criticism. Critics argue that the anthropic principle doesn't explain anything, it just restates the fact that we're here. Some see the strong version as dangerously close to pseudoscience or theology, while others defend it as a useful reminder of observer bias in cosmology. Compatibilism versus incompatibilism. The debate between compatibilism and incompatibilism centers around the concept of free will and its relationship to determinism, the idea that every event or action is the result of preceding causes. Determinism. Determinism suggests that all events, including human actions, are the inevitable result of previous causes governed by the laws of nature. If the universe is deterministic, then theoretically everything that happens, including your choices, could be predicted if all prior conditions were known. This raises a critical question. If our actions are predetermined, can we truly be free? Incompatibilism. Incompatibilists answer no. Free will and determinism cannot coexist. There are two main forms of incompatibilism. 1. Hard determinism. Accepts determinism and rejects free will. According to this view, all choices are illusions. Our sense of agency is just the outcome of prior causes beyond our control. Moral responsibility becomes questionable under this view. 2. Libertarian free will. Rejects determinism and affirms free will. Proponents argue that for a choice to be free, it must be undetermined. not caused by prior events. This suggests that humans have a unique capacity to choose freely, even if it defies causal laws. Compatibilism. Compatibilists, on the other hand, believe that free will and determinism can coexist. According to this view, freedom does not mean that our choices are uncaused, but rather that we are acting in accordance with our own desires, intentions, and reasoning, even if those are shaped by prior causes. Famous compatibilists like David Hume and Daniel Dennett argue that free will is about being the originator of actions, not about escaping causality entirely. If no one is forcing you and you're acting rationally, you are free, even if your decision had a cause. Why it matters. This debate has deep implications for ethics, law, and personal responsibility. If determinism is true and incompatibilism is correct, then punishing someone for a crime may seem unjust. They had no choice. But if compatibilism is valid, accountability still makes sense, even in a deterministic universe. Quantum superposition and philosophy. Quantum superposition is one of the strangest concepts in physics, but it also has deep philosophical implications about reality, observation, and consciousness. According to quantum mechanics, a particle like an electron does not exist in just one state, but in multiple possible states at once, until it is measured. This idea is famously illustrated by Schrödinger's cat, a thought experiment where a cat in a box is both alive and dead until it is observed. This concept raises troubling questions about the nature of reality. If observation determines an outcome, then does reality exist independently of observation? Some interpretations, like the Copenhagen interpretation, suggest that reality remains undefined until an observer measures it. Others, like the many worlds interpretation, propose that all possible outcomes actually happen in separate parallel universes, meaning there is a universe where the cat lives and another where it dies. Philosophers and scientists have debated whether quantum mechanics implies that consciousness plays a role in shaping reality. If measurement collapses superposition, does that mean the act of observation itself creates reality? This idea has led to connections with idealism, panpsychism, and even simulation theories. Quantum superposition challenges determinism, objectivity, and materialism, forcing us to reconsider whether reality is fixed or fundamentally shaped by observation. If reality is not absolute, but instead a set of probabilities, then the world may be far stranger than we ever imagined. Hence, egoism versus altruism. The debate between egoism and altruism revolves around whether human behavior is fundamentally self-interested or genuinely motivated by concern for others. Egoism holds that people act primarily out of self-interest, whether consciously or unconsciously. Altruism, on the other hand, suggests that people are capable of acting for the benefit of others, even at personal cost. Psychological egoism, defended by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, argues that all human actions, no matter how selfless they appear, are ultimately driven by self-benefit. Even acts of kindness, such as donating to charity or saving a stranger, are said to arise from hidden motives like personal satisfaction, social approval, or long-term gain. Ethical egoism, a related but distinct position, suggests that people should act in their own self-interest, because doing so ultimately benefits society. Altruism challenges this view by asserting that genuine selflessness is possible. Thinkers like David Hume and Peter Singer argue that humans have natural empathy and can act purely for the sake of others. Evolutionary biology also suggests that altruistic behavior, such as helping relatives or members of a social group, increases the survival of genes, making it an adaptive trait. The tension between egoism and altruism raises fundamental moral questions. Are humans naturally selfish? Is helping others ever truly selfless? And should we prioritize our own well-being or the greater good? This debate influences ethics, psychology, and even economics, shaping how we understand human motivation and moral responsibility. The Chinese room argument. The Chinese room argument, proposed by philosopher John Searle, is a thought experiment that challenges the idea that artificial intelligence, AI, can truly understand or possess consciousness. It is designed as a critique of strong AI, which claims that a computer program could actually have a mind and comprehend language the way humans do. Searle asks us to imagine a person inside a closed room who does not understand Chinese. This person receives Chinese symbols through a slot and uses an English instruction manual to match inputs with the correct Chinese outputs. From the outside, it appears as if the person understands Chinese, but in reality, they are simply following syntactic rules without any comprehension. Searle argues that this is exactly how AI functions. It manipulates symbols and follows instructions, but it has no understanding of meaning. According to him, computers, even the most sophisticated ones, operate syntactically, not semantically. They simulate understanding, but do not actually experience it. Therefore, even if a machine passes the Turing test by convincingly simulating human conversation, it does not mean the machine understands anything. It merely mimics understanding. Critics of the argument, such as Daniel Dennett, argue that the human brain itself is just a complex information processor, and that understanding could emerge from sufficiently advanced computation. Others believe that deeper forms of AI, such as those using neural networks, might eventually achieve true consciousness. Still, the Chinese room argument remains a powerful and influential challenge in the philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, and cognitive science. It raises a fundamental question. Can machines ever truly think, or are they just sophisticated symbol manipulators? Compatibilism. Compatibilism is the philosophical view that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive, that they can, in fact, coexist. While determinism holds that every event, including human actions, is the result of prior causes and natural laws, compatibilists argue that this does not eliminate the possibility of freedom. Philosophers like David Hume and Daniel Dennett support this perspective, suggesting that free will should not be understood as complete independence from causality. Instead, they propose a more practical definition. Free will is the ability to act according to one's desires, intentions, and reasoning, without external coercion. Under this view, a person who makes a choice based on their own beliefs and motivations is exercising free will, even if those motivations were shaped by previous experiences or conditions. What matters is that the action reflects the individual's internal decision-making, not that it arose from a vacuum. Critics, however, argue that if our thoughts and desires are themselves the result of causes beyond our control, then we're not truly free. If everything is determined, can we really be held morally responsible for our actions? This tension lies at the heart of one of philosophy's oldest and most debated questions. The debate between compatibilists and incompatibilists continues to shape discussions about ethics, criminal justice, and the nature of human agency. Logical positivism. Logical positivism is a philosophical movement that emerged in the early 20th century, primarily associated with the Vienna Circle, a group of scientists and philosophers, including A.J. Ayer and Rudolf Carnap. The central claim of logical positivism is that a statement is only meaningful if it can be empirically verified or is logically necessary. This idea is rooted in the verification principle, which asserts that meaningful statements must be either 1. Analytically true, true by definition, such as all bachelors are unmarried. 2. Empirically verifiable, capable of being tested through observation, like water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. Anything that doesn't meet one of these criteria, such as metaphysical claims, ethical judgments, or religious statements, is considered nonsensical or devoid of cognitive meaning. For example, a sentence like God exists or murder is wrong would be dismissed as emotionally charged but logically meaningless. Logical positivism had a major impact on philosophy, particularly the philosophy of science. It aimed to eliminate speculation and metaphysics from intellectual discourse, focusing solely on observable facts and logical analysis. However, the movement eventually faced a major problem. The verification principle itself cannot be empirically verified, nor is it analytically true. This made it self-refuting. Critics also pointed out that it dismissed large areas of meaningful human discourse, like art, morality, and personal experience. Despite its decline, logical positivism laid the groundwork for later developments in analytic philosophy and continues to influence how we think about scientific reasoning, clarity, and the demarcation between science and non-science. Ontological shock. Ontological shock occurs when a person is confronted with information or experiences that radically challenge their understanding of reality. It forces a deep, unsettling reevaluation of one's most basic beliefs about the world, existence, or self. This kind of shock can be triggered by scientific discoveries, philosophical revelations, or personal experiences that dismantle previously held assumptions. For instance, realizing that the Earth is not the center of the universe, encountering the strange implications of quantum mechanics, or seriously contemplating the idea that free will might not exist. These can all cause ontological shock. Encounters with artificial intelligence, alien life, near-death experiences, or even psychedelic states can also provoke this response. The common thread is a disruption of the mental models we use to make sense of the world. Philosophers and psychologists see ontological shock as a double-edged sword. It can lead to existential dread, disorientation, and fear, but also to intellectual growth, renewed curiosity, and profound transformation. It highlights the fragile foundations upon which much of our understanding is built. Ultimately, ontological shock reminds us that reality might be far more complex or stranger than we ever assumed. And sometimes growth only comes from having our deepest beliefs shaken to the core. Gödel's incompleteness. Theorems. Gödel's incompleteness theorems, developed by mathematician Kurt Gödel in 1931, revolutionized our understanding of mathematics, logic, and the limits of formal systems. The first incompleteness theorem states that in any consistent, sufficiently powerful formal mathematical system, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. In other words, no matter how comprehensive the system is, there will always be truths that lie beyond its ability to demonstrate. The second incompleteness theorem takes this even further. It shows that such a system cannot prove its own consistency. This means that we can never be absolutely certain that a logical system is free from contradictions using only the tools within that system. Gödel's work delivered a significant blow to the early 20th century dream of creating a complete, unified foundation for all of mathematics, a vision famously pursued by David Hilbert. Gödel showed that such completeness is fundamentally impossible. Beyond mathematics, these theorems have profound philosophical implications. They suggest that human reasoning, creativity, and understanding may always surpass the limits of formal logic in computational systems. Gödel's theorems also raise questions about the potential of artificial intelligence. If machines operate solely within formal systems, can they ever fully replicate human thought? In short, Gödel revealed that no system can explain everything, and that some truths may forever remain beyond formal reasoning, an insight as humbling as it is profound. The Frankfurt Cases. The Frankfurt Cases, introduced by philosopher Harry Frankfurt in 1969, challenge a long-held belief in moral philosophy, that moral responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. Traditionally, it was thought that a person could only be held morally responsible for an action if they had the freedom to choose a different course. If no alternative was possible, then holding them accountable seemed unjust. Frankfurt's thought experiment turns this idea on its head. Imagine a person, Jones, who decides to press a button. Unknown to him, a neuroscientist has implanted a device in his brain. If Jones were to hesitate or choose not to press the button, the device would force him to do it. But here's the twist. Jones presses the button entirely on his own. The device never activates. He acts freely, but he couldn't have done otherwise. Frankfurt argues that Jones is still morally responsible. Why? Because the action flowed from his own desires and reasoning, not from external coercion, even though alternatives were technically blocked. These cases support compatibilism, the idea that free will and determinism can coexist. They suggest that what matters is not whether we could have done otherwise, but whether our actions arise from our own internal motivations. Critics argue that nuances in Frankfurt-style examples might still allow for alternative possibilities, but the cases remain deeply influential. The Frankfurt cases challenge us to rethink freedom, responsibility, and what it truly means to be the author of our actions. The evolutionary argument against naturalism. The evolutionary argument against naturalism, ENAN, developed by philosopher Alvin Plantinga, presents a striking challenge. If both evolution and naturalism are true, then we have good reason to doubt the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Here's the reasoning. Evolution favors traits that enhance survival and reproduction, not necessarily traits that track truth. If having false beliefs leads to behavior that helps an organism survive, then evolution could very well preserve those false beliefs. For example, a primitive human who falsely believes a rustle in the bushes is always a predator might survive more often than one who accurately assesses the risk. Now, combine that with naturalism, the belief that everything, including the mind, is the product of blind physical processes with no divine guidance. If evolution doesn't care about truth, and if there is no greater rational source guiding our thinking, then why should we trust our brains to give us true beliefs? Plantinga argues that this combination, naturalism and evolution, is self-defeating. If we have no good reason to trust our cognitive faculties, then we also have no good reason to trust the beliefs produced by those faculties, including the belief in naturalism itself. Critics respond that while evolution may not guarantee perfect accuracy, it often produces reliable enough reasoning for survival, which includes discovering truths about the world. They also argue that rational thought could emerge as an evolutionary advantage, particularly in complex social and environmental contexts. Nevertheless, the EAN raises profound questions. Can we trust human reason under a purely naturalistic framework, or does our confidence in rationality point to something beyond material evolution, perhaps even a theistic explanation? This argument continues to stir debates in epistemology, philosophy of mind, and the intersection of science and religion, the extended mind hypothesis. The extended mind hypothesis, proposed by Andy Clark and David Chalmers, argues that the mind is not confined to the brain, but extends into the environment through tools, technology, and social interactions. If external objects play a crucial role in cognitive processes, they should be considered part of the mind itself. A classic example is the use of a notebook by someone with memory loss. If the person relies on the notebook to remember important information, the notebook functions as an extension of their memory. Similarly, when we use smartphones, calculators, or even conversations with others to think through problems, those tools become part of our cognitive system. So this view challenges traditional ideas that cognition is internal and brain-bound. Critics argue that tools are merely aids to thinking, not part of thought itself. But proponents say if something actively participates in cognition, it should count as part of the mind. The extended mind hypothesis has major implications for AI, neuroscience, and how we define intelligence. It invites us to see thinking as something distributed across brains, bodies, and the world. Phenomenology. Phenomenology is a philosophical movement that focuses on the structure of subjective experience. Founded by Edmund Husserl, it asks, what is it like to perceive, feel, and be aware of the world? Rather than analyzing reality through scientific or objective frameworks, phenomenology explores how the world appears to consciousness. Husserl encouraged bracketing assumptions to describe experiences as they are lived. For example, instead of asking, what is a tree? Scientifically, a phenomenologist asks, what is it like to experience a tree? Martin Heidegger, Husserl's student, expanded phenomenology into existential themes like being, time, and authenticity. Later thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty used it to explore freedom, embodiment, and identity. Phenomenology remains influential in psychology, cognitive science, and AI. It challenges us to understand not just what the world is, but how we live and perceive it from the inside. The Gavagai problem. The Gavagai problem, introduced by philosopher W.V. Quine, highlights the challenge of determining meaning in language translation. Suppose an anthropologist sees a native speaker point at a rabbit and say, Gavagai. Does Gavagai mean rabbit or animal, white fur, food, or rabbit spirit? Without knowing the speaker's conceptual framework, it's impossible to be sure. This problem suggests that language isn't just about matching words to things. It's about interpreting entire systems of meaning shaped by culture and context. The Gavagai problem remains central to discussions in linguistics, artificial intelligence, and philosophy of language. It reminds us that meaning is complex and often ambiguous, And that understanding requires more than just observing behavior. The argument from moral disagreement. The argument from moral disagreement points to the deep and persistent differences in moral beliefs across cultures and individuals as evidence against the existence of objective moral truths. If morality were like math or physics, objective and universal, we might expect more agreement. But instead, history reveals constant conflict over what is considered right or wrong. Moral relativists use this to argue that morality is subjective, shaped by culture, upbringing, and context. They suggest that moral truths are not discovered, but constructed. However, moral realists push back. They claim disagreement doesn't disprove objective morality. People also disagree about science, yet that doesn't mean science lacks truth. According to them, the problem lies in human bias, misinformation, or lack of moral insight, not in the absence of objective moral facts. This debate continues to shape how we think about ethics, justice, and cross-cultural dialogue. Moral dumbfounding. Moral dumbfounding refers to moments when people strongly believe something is morally wrong but cannot explain why. The term was popularized by psychologist Jonathan Haidt through experiments that revealed how people often rely on gut feelings, not reason, when making moral judgments. For example, participants were told a story of two siblings who engaged in consensual harmless incest. Most immediately declared it wrong, but when pressed for reasons, they struggled. "It just feels wrong," was the most common response. This shows that moral reasoning is often post hoc. We react emotionally, then try to rationalize after the fact. It supports the idea that morality is grounded more in intuition and emotion than in logic. Moral dumbfounding challenges the belief that we are always rational moral agents and highlights the role of subconscious factors in ethical decisions. Boltzmann. Brains. The Boltzmann brain hypothesis is a bizarre and unsettling idea from physics and cosmology. It suggests that in an infinite or very old universe, random fluctuations could spontaneously create self-aware entities, like a brain floating in space, complete with false memories and a sense of reality. Statistically, it might be more likely for a single brain to randomly form than for an entire orderly universe to evolve. If so, it raises the eerie question, what if you are a Boltzmann brain? Most scientists reject this scenario, arguing that it leads to absurd consequences and contradicts what we observe. But the paradox still forces us to think about entropy, consciousness, and the reliability of our experiences. Boltzmann. Brains highlight how probability, randomness, and the nature of time can challenge our most basic assumptions about reality. Deontic logic. Deontic logic is the formal study of normative concepts like obligation, permission, and prohibition. While traditional logic deals with what is true or false, deontic logic deals with what ought to be done. For example, statements like, "You must tell the truth," or "lying is forbidden," can be analyzed logically to assess consistency and consequences. Deontic logic is used in ethics, legal theory, and even artificial intelligence, especially in designing machines that must follow ethical guidelines. However, it also faces challenges. What happens when two obligations conflict? What do we do when what is permissible contradicts what is ideal? Deontic logic helps clarify ethical thinking, but also reminds us that morality is complex and not always neatly reducible to formulas. The problem of dirty hands. The problem of dirty hands is a moral dilemma that arises when someone, usually a political leader, must commit a morally wrong act to achieve a greater good. Lying to the public, ordering violence, or breaking the law to prevent disaster, these are all examples. Philosopher Michael Walzer explored this in Political Ethics. Can a leader do something bad, like torture a suspect, if it means saving lives? Is that still moral? This problem exposes the tension between deontological ethics, which holds that some actions are always wrong, and consequentialism, which evaluates actions based on outcomes. The problem of dirty hands remains a central question in governance, war, and leadership. It asks, can doing wrong ever be right, and if so, at what cost? Here are the final 10 philosophical concepts, 91-100, written in voiceover-style punctuation. Matching the tone and structure of your earlier entries, the veil of perception. The veil of perception is the idea that we never perceive the external world directly. Instead, we experience it indirectly, filtered through our senses, emotions, and mental states. This veil means we can never be sure the world is as it appears. A red apple may seem red to you, but do you perceive the apple, or just your impression of it? Philosophers like John Locke and George Berkeley explored this dilemma. Locke argued that we perceive representations, not reality itself. Berkeley went further, claiming that perception creates reality. The veil challenges our confidence in empirical knowledge. If all we ever know are appearances, how can we claim anything about the world beyond them? It's a profound reminder. What we see may not be what truly is. Moral luck. Moral luck asks a troubling question. Can we be morally judged for things beyond our control? Imagine two drunk drivers take the same reckless risk. One hits a pedestrian, the other gets home safely. Do we blame one more than the other? Philosopher Thomas Nagel identified this as a contradiction. We think morality requires control, but we still judge based on outcomes. There's resultant luck, how things turn out. Circumstantial luck, what situations people face. Constitutive luck, our personalities. And causal luck, the chain of events leading to our actions. Moral luck reveals a gap between our ethical ideals and real-world judgment. It forces us to ask, is it fair to blame or praise someone for what they never chose? The ticking time bomb scenario. The ticking time bomb scenario is one of philosophy's most controversial hypotheticals. A terrorist has planted a bomb that will kill thousands. You have him in custody. He won't talk. Do you torture him to save lives? This thought experiment is used to justify or challenge the ethics of torture under extreme conditions. Supporters argue it's about the greater good. Sacrifice one to save many. Critics say it opens the door to abuse, eroding human rights and moral integrity. But here's the twist. Real life isn't a clean hypothetical. We rarely have perfect knowledge or clear timelines. So how do we make ethical choices under pressure? The scenario forces us to ask, can doing something morally wrong ever be morally right? Epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice is when someone is wrong not through violence or insult, but through being dismissed as a knower, their voice silenced, their credibility denied. Coined by philosopher Miranda Fricker, it comes in two main forms. 1. Testimonial injustice. When someone's word is doubted due to prejudice, like when a victim isn't believed because of their gender, race, or background. 2. Hermeneutical injustice. When people lack the concepts or language to describe their experience. Think of victims of harassment before the term even existed. Epistemic injustice reminds us, knowledge is power, and denying someone's voice is a moral harm. The problem of other minds. How do you know other people have minds? You see bodies, faces, and speech, but you never experience their thoughts directly. This is the problem of other minds. It's easy to assume others think and feel like us, but from a strict philosophical stance, it's an assumption, not proof. Philosophers like Descartes and Wittgenstein explored this dilemma. Are expressions of pain, like crying, proof of suffering, or just behaviors? In psychology, this links to theory of mind, our ability to infer mental states. But even with empathy, the question remains, can we ever truly know another's consciousness? Hard determinism. Hard determinism is the view that free will is an illusion. Every action, thought, and choice you make was determined by prior causes, by biology, upbringing, and laws of physics. According to this viewing, you're not making choices, you're experiencing them, like dominoes falling in a chain that started before you were born. This clashes with how we see ourselves as moral agents, responsible for our actions. But if nothing is truly up to us, can anyone be held accountable? Hard determinism raises deep questions about justice, ethics, and identity. If free will doesn't exist, should punishment? Moral realism versus anti-realism. Moral realism is the belief that moral facts exist, independent of human opinion. Lying is wrong, kindness is good, These truths hold whether or not we believe them, and you see moral anti-realism disagrees. It claims morality is a human construct shaped by culture, biology, or emotion. Realists say moral truths are like mathematical facts, objective and discoverable. Anti-realists see morality as a product of evolution or social agreement. So our values found are made. This debate shapes ethics, law, and political philosophy, forcing us to ask, are we uncovering truths or just agreeing on rules? The argument from consciousness. The argument from consciousness claims that human awareness is so mysterious, it can't be explained by physical processes alone. Materialism says the brain produces mind. But the argument asks, how does flesh and neurons give rise to thought and self-awareness? Some philosophers and theists argue that consciousness points to a non-material reality, possibly even divine design. Critics respond that science is making progress, and mystery isn't proof. But the hard problem remains. Why does being alive feel like anything at all? Attino, philosophical behaviorism. Philosophical behaviorism suggests that mental states are nothing more than observable behavior. Instead of saying I'm in pain, behaviorists focus on how you act, wincing, crying, or avoiding harm. This approach, influenced by B.F. Skinner and others, tried to make psychology more scientific, reducing thoughts to patterns we can see and measure. But critics argue it misses the inner experience, the difference between acting in pain and feeling it. Still, behaviorism laid groundwork for cognitive science and psychology, even as it reminds us that not all truths can be seen. Pluralism versus monism in ethics and metaphysics. In philosophy, monism is the idea that reality, or value, can be explained by one fundamental principle. Everything is mind, or matter, or God, one source, one truth. Pluralism, on the other hand, says reality is diverse. There are many kinds of things, many sources of value, many truths. In ethics, a monist might say all morality reduces to pleasure or duty. A pluralist says no, there are many values, justice, love, truth, autonomy, each with their own weight. In metaphysics, pluralists argue that reality can't be compressed into one thing. To understand the world, we must embrace its complexity. So the question is there one truth behind everything, or a tapestry of truths woven together?